The story began with a beautiful sunrise over a big city. However, one guy had been on his feet for a long time, working tirelessly. His day always started way too early. He was very meticulous about cleaning his place because, in his opinion, cleanliness was crucial. Soon, the entire room was supposed to be spotless, with only the last few inches of dirt remaining. Suddenly, the man sat down on the floor, left his rag behind, and relaxed. A slight smile appeared on his face as he realized he had finished and everything was finally clean. But he continued to sit on the floor, enjoying the order he had created with his own hands. He looked around the room one more time and praised himself for the cleanliness of his home. Besides, he had mopped the floor 3 times and checked everything, so it was time to wrap it up. Still, he really decided to finish cleaning and started gathering his rags from the floor. After that, he tossed them into the sink and decided to do some laundry. Admiring himself, he hummed and even danced a little. However, the man kept staring at something behind him that he saw in the mirror. In the bathroom filled with blood lay the bodies of dead people. They were tied up, their mouths taped shut, and at that moment the man was getting ready to wash them. There was no time to waste, so he immediately began his dirty work. Meanwhile, 11 hours had passed and the police, along with forensic experts, were already in the apartment. A mysterious young man, who likely had some connection to the crime, entered the apartment. It seemed his arrival was a real relief as the others were glad to see him. At this point, it was already known that the daughter of one of the victims had reported what had happened. Moreover, when the people entered the place, the bodies were completely clean, just like the entire house. This led to the conclusion that the criminal had been in the house for a long time as he had managed to clean up and had the opportunity to do so. What was happening resembled similar crimes in Chunoldong and Sinpyeong as the method of killing was the same and the distance between the cities wasn't far. Additionally, there was one common detail: the clean bodies and the crime scene, leading to the conclusion that the killer was the same person. Therefore, the men began to ponder what to do next. It was crucial to come up with a logical plan at that stage to find the killer and protect future victims. This idea struck the man as he remembered that surveillance cameras covered 3 areas and were located not far from the crime scene, so it was possible to find people connected to the crime. Meanwhile, the mysterious man was sitting behind the wheel of a car, driving too fast. He was listening to the radio, which was broadcasting urgent news about the murders in Chuholdong, Sinpyeong, and Yeongjong. It was clear that the crimes that occurred there were as brutal and bizarre as to shock everyone. Furthermore, it was established that the perpetrator was alone and an investigation had begun. Additionally, a close-up photo of the criminal was published, and a huge reward of 10 million won was offered to anyone who could find him and report to the police. Moreover, the police promised to do everything possible to catch him as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, the mysterious man arrived at the planned location and was stretching his muscles by his car. When he finished, he pulled out a cigarette and was about to light it. The man was surprisingly calm as he was hiding some terrible secret. Suddenly, he climbed into his own car. He took the car out of gear, allowing it to roll down the hill. Then, he calmly watched as his car rolled toward the cliff, soon to be destroyed forever. It seemed such an act was entirely justified, and he was preparing for it. After all, it was the only way to cover up the traces of the crime and protect himself from being pursued. The car began to sink in the water. It became clear that the man was not an ordinary tourist and had something to hide. After all, an ordinary person would never take such a step and would not easily destroy their own car as he did. The guy looked at the settlement on the other side of the river, at the empty streets and many ruined and abandoned houses. He concluded that nothing had changed in that place and everything remained as it had been for a long time. Also, noticing another interesting detail, he reached an incredible conclusion. The sacred tree that had stood in the settlement for many years had been cut down. The person who destroyed that sacred symbol seemed to not even realize what they had done. After all, such an act required a lot of effort because the tree protected the entire village and the shrine. While pondering the fate of the sacred tree and the settlement, the guy didn't notice the strange man standing behind him. He began to ask the guy who he was and what he was doing in their settlement at such a time. When the guy didn't respond and just silently stared into his eyes, the man began to get angry and raised his voice. Suddenly, the guy turned around and stopped in front of the resident. He asked if the man was a resident of the settlement and how he had managed to find him. Suddenly, the man began to scream wildly. His eyes filled with blood, and it seemed he was ready to kill the guy who had intruded on his territory. But this couldn't rattle the hero. He remained calm and just silently watched as the old man got angrier. Suddenly, he heard the voice of a girl running toward them. It was clear that she was the daughter of the furious man, and she immediately began to apologize for his behavior. It became evident that her father was not in his right mind, and at that moment she was trying to take him away and calm him down. And it worked, as hearing about food immediately calmed the man down, and it seemed like nothing had happened. Also, the girl was about to talk to the hero and asked her father to wait for her. Right away, she began to apologize again for her father's behavior, understanding that he might have frightened the stranger. However, the guy denied everything and assured her that everything was fine and he wasn't offended by him. The girl noticed his backpack and assumed he was a traveler. But the guy replied that he had recently moved to the area and planned to settle in their settlement soon. With his words, he once again drew the attention of the sick man. Moreover, the girl looked at him with surprise. After all, she didn't understand how someone could move with just one suitcase. Obviously, it would take much more stuff. But to divert attention from himself, the man began to convince her that he was the grandson of one of the residents of the settlement, to which the girl continued to bombard him with questions. So, the guy told her about his grandmother named Kim Jong-ja. However, from the girl's reaction, it was clear she had never heard that name before and immediately began to think, trying to remember. Suddenly, with horror, she realized that the woman had been dead for 3 years. Looking at the guy's face, she saw that he immediately became sadder. After all, he was trying to pretend he knew nothing about her death, and it seemed he was doing a good job of it. However, unexpectedly, the guy smiled. This frightened the girl a lot, as he said he was just joking. Moreover, she didn't understand how someone could joke like that and not feel any guilt or shame. Additionally, she clearly remembered the face and was sure she hadn't seen the unknown guy at the woman's funeral. Therefore, she had quite logical doubts that the guy could be an imposter and really didn't know any Kim Jong-ja, especially that he had never been her grandson. But the guy started to wriggle out of it again and said he indeed hadn't attended her funeral. Also, he seemed angry at the girl, thinking such questions shouldn't have been asked. The girl was angry because she didn't understand what could be more important that day than the funeral of a loved one. And it was very important for her to find out the real reason, especially since the unknown man intended to live in her house. Suddenly, the guy laughed out loud, and the girl, in turn, was shocked by his behavior. She was upset, as she saw nothing funny in her words. Moreover, the guy thought he wasn't the only one who hadn't been at the funeral. He spoke about certain reasons and assured her that the elders in the settlement could confirm his words. Suddenly, behind the girl, an old man's shout was heard. He showed the girl a huge snake he had caught in the grass. The snake was trying to escape, writhing terribly in his hands. Meanwhile, the guy was preparing to leave the father and his daughter. He left behind only a pile of questions. And the girl was trying to remember his grandmother, analyzing every word he said, as the guy was indeed very strange. Meanwhile, the guy was trying to find his grandmother's spare key. He was shocked because it wasn't in the usual place where it could be. However, after a few attempts, he finally managed to find it. His grandmother had hidden the key in the most remote spot so that no one could reach it. Still, after finding the key, the man tried to enter his grandmother's house. Opening the door, he saw that everything inside was perfectly in order and the lights were even on. Moreover, water was running from the faucet, which meant everything was working and in good condition. The guy continued to check all the electrical appliances in the house. To his surprise, everything was working perfectly and he couldn't understand why. Why, after such a long time, everything in the house was functioning and remained in perfect condition. Furthermore, the biggest surprise was that both water and electricity were working. Suddenly, the man realized what mistake he had made at that moment and immediately turned off the light. Drawing his weapon, he prepared and hid, as he expected to be attacked at any moment. The perfect cleanliness in the house only meant that someone had been living there all the time. However, he didn't understand who could be hiding in the house and how an unwanted guest could have gotten in. Suddenly, he heard some suspicious noise outside. Turning his attention to it, he realized that it could be the people who had been living in his grandmother's house for the past 3 years returning. So, hiding his weapon behind his belt, he decided to check who those people were and what the noise outside was about. Calmly, he headed toward the gate, hoping to drive away the unknown people, but still prepared for the worst and remained vigilant. Outside, a whole crowd of men had gathered, their appearance showing they were determined. Suddenly, the locked gate opened. The hero, the true heir and descendant of the dead woman, stepped out to meet them. Before him stood the village elder, No Suk-dae, who wanted to talk to the hero and find out who he was and what he was doing in the house. He also inquired whether the guy was indeed the grandson of the woman and noted that the gates had been locked, so it was strange that he had managed to get inside. However, the hero did not respond, only staring intently at the faces of the strangers. He didn't understand what they wanted to achieve with their visit, as he had no intention of leaving the house, let alone explaining anything to them. Suddenly, one of the guests began to shout, outraged that the guy was ignoring the elder and not answering his questions. But immediately, the elder intervened in the argument and calmed both of them down. He assured them that the purpose of his visit was simply to talk and that they meant no harm. He was only interested in how the guy had gotten inside the house and what his true purpose for visiting was. However, the hero had no intention of answering. On the contrary, he began to ask many questions. Thus, he tried to divert suspicion away from himself. But he didn't realize that this could only irritate the men more. Moreover, he kept repeating that he was indeed the grandson of the dead woman. At that moment, one of the villagers grabbed him by the neck and accused him of being rude to the village elder. He didn't like the guy's behavior and the disrespect with which he spoke. In response, he received only a smile from the hero. It was clear that this didn't scare him at all, and the elder was impressed by such audacity. Meanwhile, the hero continued to laugh, ignoring the angry crowd in front of him. Suddenly, his assailant prepared to strike. However, the guy managed to anticipate him, and to stop him, he had to hit back with his head. This made the attacker scream in pain. His nose was broken, and his head hurt terribly. Moreover, the guy accused the man of rudeness, and his actions could be recognized as self-defense. The guy also realized one important thing: that despite their friend being hurt, none of them reacted at all and didn't even try to defend or help. And he was convinced that it was the elder's fault, as everyone could be waiting for orders from him or were simply afraid of him. The elder addressed the man named Hyunseop and asked how long he planned to lie on the ground. Strangely, he simply got up and apologized to the elder. At that moment, the old man approached the hero, stopped in front of him, and examined him closely. He said that one of his men had acted poorly and was actually apologizing on his behalf. He also laughed slyly, and at that moment his behavior seemed the most bizarre. Moreover, he continued to stare intently at the boys' faces and didn't stop smiling. He said he had been able to see him well and recognize him. After that, he ordered his men to return to the settlement, as he was convinced that the hero was indeed the grandson of that same woman. After his words, everyone turned around without further questions and prepared to leave. But the guy, who understood nothing and remained standing in shock by the gate, made them stop. He spoke about how his house was in very good condition, so it seemed that someone had been living there. However, the elder didn't believe the guy's words, as his grandmother had left without saying goodbye to her family. Therefore, to prevent the house from falling apart, the villagers helped each other in turn and could occasionally clean the house. When the guy understood everything, he was ready to let the elder and his men go. But Hyunseop couldn't calm down. He couldn't believe that the guy would just be allowed to live in that house. To dispel his protégé's doubts, the elder made him look at the roof of the building where the main character was staying. What Hyunseop saw there terrified him greatly. It was the spirit of some kind of monster. Moreover, the elder was very pleased because the monster was dancing with joy, full of enthusiasm. So, it could be considered that the matter was settled and the men had no grievances against the boy. Suddenly, out of nowhere, the same girl appeared, the daughter of the crazy old man. However, the boy didn't notice her and was lost in thought about what had happened the day before and the people who had come to see him. But he realized he had left his pack of cigarettes inside. Just as he was about to head back, he suddenly heard a familiar voice and saw the girl running toward him. She asked what the elder wanted with him, but he didn't answer and only asked her about cigarettes, hoping she smoked too. He also thought that the girl might have told the elder about what happened, which was why he had come to see him. But she was adamant in denying any involvement and insisted she had nothing to do with his visit. However, the hero didn't get angry with her and tried to show his kindness in every way he could. But the woman couldn't calm down and kept asking the boy about the recent visit. The hero found her behavior suspicious and explained that the men wanted to make sure he was really who he claimed to be. Suddenly, the woman got nervous and was about to leave. The only thing she said was that the boy would soon regret it. After that, she silently walked away, leaving the hero alone with his thoughts. But it seemed he didn't care and wasn't even planning to stop her. So after a while, she stopped on her own. Breathing heavily, she realized she hadn't said everything and couldn't just let the boy go. She knew she risked never seeing him again. So she called out to him again and made him stop. She understood that the boy had come empty-handed and had no belongings with him. So she thought it would be reasonable to at least bring him a pillow. It seemed the boy didn't mind, so she rushed back home while he was left waiting. She didn't know if the hero would wait for her, but it was the only thing she could do for him. Meanwhile, the boy was completely confused. He continued to wait for the girl, curious about what she really wanted from him. After a while, he heard a commotion at his gate again. He understood it was the girl returning with a pillow for him. When he met her, he saw disappointment on her face because, in reality, he hadn't waited for her. At the same time, the girl brought him a pillow and a blanket, convinced he didn't have any. The girl's behavior raised many questions for the hero, and he couldn't understand why she was doing this. It was all very strange since the woman had been scolding him the day before. His words shocked the girl, and for a moment, she stood silently, unable to say anything. But eventually, she apologized for her behavior and admitted she suspected him of deceit. It seemed she simply felt sorry for him and wanted to make amends. So she extended her things to the man, hoping he would accept them. The boy, in despair, took her pillow and blanket. After that, the girl simply ran away, offering no explanation. She quickly distanced herself from the boy, feeling an incredible shame for her recent behavior. But suddenly, she turned back and decided to look him in the eye again. To her surprise, she realized the boy was still watching her and hadn't moved from his spot. But in reality, the hero was just trying to figure out what had happened. After a while, he entered his new place. His mind was troubled and he couldn't connect the events that had occurred the day before. As he considered various scenarios, he even started to feel anxious. He also thought about the girl, her visit, and the gift. He found her behavior and kindness strange. He was also plagued by suspicions, so he decided to check the contents of the pillow and blanket. Immediately, he cut open the pillow, trying to find a hidden microphone or some other device. To his surprise, he actually found a very interesting object inside, the origin of which he didn't understand yet. Meanwhile, a new day dawned in the settlement. The hero, as usual, went through his morning routine and listened to the news. Moreover, exercising was a mandatory and special ritual for him. He paid great attention to physical exercises and took his health and physical condition seriously. So, physical exercise was something more for him than just a daily routine. After exercising, he took care of his skin and face, which also held great personal significance for him. He couldn't forget about the events that had happened to him the previous night and couldn't stop thinking about the mysterious piece of paper. The scene shifted to a chicken farm belonging to some household in the settlement. There were quite a few chickens. Therefore, someone had to constantly feed them and keep an eye on them. It became clear that it was Hyunseop, though it was unclear why, but he was catching chickens from a cage. However, when he finished, he was noticed by a man who was likely the owner of the chickens. Hyunseop explained his crime by saying that the elder needed a white chicken. But the owner didn't like that, as his chickens had been taken before, and he didn't understand what made his chickens so special. The man believed that chickens could be bought in town and didn't need to be stolen, as that was illegal. However, Hyunseop shot him a nasty look and accused him of not following the elder's orders and daring to contradict his words. Although the man was scared, he insisted on his point, believing that his chickens were his property and he shouldn't have to share them. Still, the thief couldn't hold back and began to accuse the man, openly threatening him. He advised the old man to just let him go and not create problems for anyone. Meanwhile, the hero's morning routine continued and he decided to go for a run. He decided to sprint the short distance that lay ahead at maximum speed. However, his strength quickly left him and he realized he couldn't go on. Previously, he could run much faster and longer, so he blamed his loss of endurance on smoking. In general, it was pointless to talk about the harm it caused, and the boy understood that perfectly well, but nothing could be changed. Suddenly, he witnessed a quarrel between two men over a chicken. Hyunseop didn't want to pay the reward for the animal as the man requested and also didn't want to return it to its owner. So, unable to withstand the man's words, he simply hit him, nearly killing the poor animal. The man lay on the ground in a pile of feathers. He was shocked and deeply disappointed. At that moment, Hyunseop froze and couldn't move. After what had happened, he was simply left speechless. The thing was, behind the man, he saw the elder who had accidentally witnessed everything and appeared out of nowhere. The elder was very angry and it became clear that Hyunseop was in for big trouble. The elder expressed his concern to the man, as he had been absent for a very long time. The man realized he was in trouble and didn't know how to explain what had happened. The elder began to scold Hyunseop, as he couldn't control himself, and his actions could anger the mother. He also addressed the victim by name, Song-sik, and asked how he was feeling. Concerned, Hyunseop didn't know how he could face his mother and what to do to keep her from getting angry. Meanwhile, the elder wanted to pay the man for the chicken and tried to find out its price. But Hyunseop insisted on his point. He was willing to do anything and sought advice from the elder. But the man believed that the person who committed the crime should bear the responsibility for it, so he couldn't decide or determine the punishment. At that moment, the hero witnessed quite a strange scene that amused him. He noticed that Hyunseop began to hit himself. He was pleading with his mother not to be angry, as he had already started punishing himself and intended to continue until her anger subsided. The blows continued, and Song-sik watched in surprise at what was happening. But at that moment he was about to leave. The boy, who was enjoying a beautiful day and witnessing an unusual event, heard footsteps behind him. It was the same girl, and seizing the moment, he asked how long it had been so lively in the village. From her response, it became clear that it hadn't always been this way. She was convinced that they didn't have to watch what was happening and that it would be better to go to a safer and quieter place. The boy didn't understand what she was planning again and didn't rush to get up and follow her this time. However, she didn't understand why he was waiting and not listening to her, and suddenly she heard a question about the events of the previous day and what had really happened. After all, he found it quite strange that the woman was so interested in him and constantly tried to find him. It also became clear that she was happy when she heard that the boy would be staying in their settlement for a long time. The very fact that the boy decided to stay in the settlement made her act this way. But the boy, interrupting her, reached into his pocket. From there, he pulled out the item the girl had placed in the pillow and held it right in front of her face. Seeing this, the girl was very surprised and blushed, as she hadn't expected the boy to find that object. She explained that she was just checking it, as it was hard for her to trust someone unfamiliar. But the object didn't resemble a microphone or a listening device, rather it looked like some kind of talisman or charm. Unable to hold back, the boy asked again why the girl had given him that object. At that moment, the girl began to sweat, realizing that her answer might not please the boy. Moreover, she worried that he might simply not believe her, as the truth sounded like nonsense. Still, the girl gathered her courage to explain that it was a talisman that protected against the ghosts that infested the entire settlement. Taking it in both hands and holding it out in front of the girl, the boy asked if she had brought it into the house because she was truly afraid of ghosts. And without waiting for an answer, he simply tore it apart in front of her eyes. Unable to contain herself, she began to yell at the boy, as she couldn't understand the motive behind his actions, especially why he would destroy the object. But the man explained that the thing was that he didn't believe in such shamanic tricks and that ghosts didn't exist in principle. Thanking the girl for her attention, he was about to leave. And the boy simply crumpled her protective charm. He also intended to throw it away, as a torn charm couldn't be effective. At that moment, the ruined object fell to the ground. Saying goodbye to the woman, he promised to let her know if he ever saw a ghost with his own eyes. However, deep down, he believed that would never happen, while the girl watched him leave and regretted that she had sincerely wanted to help him. Night fell in the settlement. The same man, the owner of the farm, was busy with his own affairs in his yard. Song-sik couldn't calm down because the chicken thief had hit him and hadn't even received a response or any reasonable punishment. However, he flinched when he saw the elder, and that thought greatly pleased Song-sik. He continued to sit and think about a plan for revenge and what punishment his opponent deserved. In his mind, he replayed possible dialogue scenarios and got angry that they looked down on him. Suddenly, he swung at a chicken that was just passing by. With one swift motion, he managed to behead the chicken and take its life. However, this didn't make him feel any better, as he imagined Hyunseop in place of the unfortunate animal. What he did to the chicken seemed right to him at that moment. Moreover, he firmly decided to take revenge on Hyunseop and was preparing to set out in search of him. Song-sik simply couldn't allow anyone to dare insult him. Rising, the man set out to find him. He knew the place where Hyunseop lived or might be, and that was where he intended to check. Arriving at his house, he began to call out his name, hoping to be heard and responded to. He was also smiling and looked very pleased, as he was happy that he would soon take revenge on his tormentor. The man also added that he had come to collect money for the chicken that had been attempted to be taken from him. So he was about to enter the yard and had already started to open the door. He looked very focused and was ready to kill his victim without the slightest hesitation. So he pulled hard on the handle and pulled the door toward him. At that moment, Hyunseop, who heard a strange noise behind his fence, decided to check what was really going on. His astonishment knew no bounds when he saw the same old man in his yard in the middle of the night. Moreover, he was armed and determined, and he had no intention of negotiating. Song-sik kept laughing and looked very frightening. But the man couldn't understand what Song-sik wanted from him and didn't expect that he might actually attack him. He also knew that after such an act, Song-sik could be severely punished, as he would tear his mother apart. However, it became clear that the old man wasn't thinking about that, as revenge and retribution were his top priorities. He was convinced that his tormentor deserved to face consequences, and the punishment he had assigned himself was insufficient. Suddenly, he attacked Hyunseop and was about to inflict serious wounds on him. The man couldn't believe his eyes. He wasn't prepared for such a turn of events. He had to act decisively, as he risked getting mortally wounded, so he managed to dodge. Next, he tried to grab the old man's hand and wrest the knife away from him. But the old man wouldn't give up and kept trying to strike his opponent, aiming to inflict serious harm. He was determined to stab him and take revenge for how he had been treated. When the man couldn't wrest the knife from his attacker, he attempted to throw him to the ground and tripped him. Song-sik began to lose his balance as the man pressed down on him with his body weight. Still, the knife slipped from his hands and lay on the ground nearby. The confrontation between the two men escalated into a full-blown fight. Hyunseop, who had previously had a good relationship with the old man, was convinced that his feelings had changed forever as the old man dared to wave a knife and wanted to kill him. So he started punching the man in the nose and face, trying to inflict as much damage as possible. He also thought the man was a psycho and was clearly going through a tough time. He was incredibly angry and continued to beat the old man with all his might. Moreover, he didn't pay attention to the fact that his opponent was much older and powerless, unable to resist. The events shifted to the main character's home. The next morning, he got ready for his usual walk and started warming up. Suddenly, he saw the same girl by his gate, sitting and waiting for him. Seeing her, he was taken aback as he hadn't expected her to show up after what had happened. He asked the girl about the purpose of her visit. From her words, it became clear that there was a gathering in the settlement called specifically because of the boy's arrival. And the boy didn't understand what he could have done that was so bad or if it was really that important. But without understanding anything, he saw the girl grab his hand and start pulling him along. She said they had very little time and the gathering had already started. She also mentioned that they absolutely had to be there, and everyone had been waiting for them. So, in a flash, they headed to the meeting place. The location was a large building, something like a school that could hold a lot of people. However, before entering, the girl stopped. She told the boy that he needed to agree with everything and not act suspiciously. After that, they were ready to go inside and become part of the gathering. In front of them stood the village elder and his followers, who stopped talking when they saw the hero. It was clear that they had been waiting for their arrival for a long time and sighed in relief when it finally happened. The hero asked the girl who the elder really was, as he acted like a king, and it was very strange that all the men in the settlement obeyed him. The boy also accused the elder of disrupting his schedule as he had to waste his own time to attend the meeting. At that moment, the elder lit a cigarette and apologized to the hero. His behavior raised concerns among his followers. However, the elder ignored their judgment and silently continued smoking. Suddenly, he asked what role the boy intended to play for their settlement. But the hero didn't understand a word and didn't know how to behave. The elder continued speaking and suggested he join their crime-fighting group, which aimed to prevent any wrongdoing in their village. But the hero didn't like that initiative at all and immediately refused. This drew disapproving looks from the men. All the men immediately glared at him with noticeable anger as his behavior seemed too audacious. The girl was also shocked by his behavior and that he could simply refuse without obeying the elders. The boy also said he had come to the settlement to live peacefully, after which he turned to leave. Immediately, accusations flew toward the elder, as he hadn't even tried to stop him. The men were angry at the boy for refusing to listen to them and believed he had no right to live with them in the same settlement. However, the elder began to calm them down. After his words, the nervous and worried men looked at him, waiting to see what would happen next. The elder decided to leave the boy to his mother as he didn't know what to do with him. He also noticed that Song-sik was absent from the gathering and asked Hyunseop why he was missing. But the man didn't respond and became even more anxious. However, he understood that he couldn't just stay silent and explained that they had fought the previous night. To his surprise, the elder replied that he had done a good thing as he had saved the man in that way. Then all the men and the elder sat in silence. Finally, the gathering could be considered over as the elder planned to be alone to pray. But everyone noticed that the girl wasn't returning to the gathering and wasn't participating in the discussion. In fact, she was trying to catch up with the hero and wanted to convince him to come back. But the boy didn't stop and had no desire to talk to her. Still, she managed to catch up with him and said it was already noon. She also asked what the boy's name was, as she didn't know how to address him. He replied that his name was Hyo Myong. Hearing this, the girl smiled. Immediately, she started yelling at the boy, accusing him of leaving the gathering so easily as she had warned him to agree with everything. However, the boy didn't understand the importance of her words as he was convinced he didn't have to help others and planned to live only for himself. He also fell silent and prepared to light a cigarette. But the girl was convinced that living comfortably could only be achieved in one way. Specifically, by not contradicting the words of the elders and listening to them, as otherwise there could be terrible consequences. But the hero was indifferent to her words. He didn't hear her and didn't believe a word. To him, it was nonsense, just like her stories about spirits. Meanwhile, the events shifted to the elder's house where he was praying. On the table, next to the figurines and icons, sat a live chicken. It seemed he was conducting some secret ritual or perhaps even performing a sacrifice. His prayer was something terrifying. His gaze and movements were so mysterious that they sent chills down one's spine. It seemed that, for the chicken, everything was about to come to an end, as it was to become the victim of an incomprehensible ritual. After a while, it all ended and the man killed the chicken. The entire room and the statues were covered in blood. However, the ritual didn't end there. The worst was yet to come. The elder smeared his body and eyes with the blood of the dead animal. While doing so, he thanked and praised the mother for salvation. Meanwhile, an unknown car was driving down the night highway. Behind the wheel was a man who looked very tired, having had a long day. In the passenger seat sat his son, who dreamed of becoming a police officer just like his father. But the man assured him that his job was very hard and dangerous, so the boy should think of a different profession for the future. However, the boy wanted nothing more than to protect his mom and dad, so he truly dreamed of such a job. And he was determined to punish anyone who dared to disturb his family. The father told the boy about an anonymous police officer who could easily deal with any wrongdoers, and they could decide the punishment for people. Moreover, by choosing this profession, the boy committed to studying hard and getting good grades in law school. Suddenly, the woman turned to the man with concern. Up ahead, she noticed a car trying to back out of a street. The driver of the truck might not see them, and at that moment he accelerated. Suddenly and very quickly, he blocked the way of the sedan, causing an emergency situation. The collision was unavoidable as the road was too narrow. Therefore, the man shouted for his family members to brace for impact. She hugged her son close, shielding him with her own body. And then, the terrible collision happened. As a result of the accident, the man's car was severely damaged. The glass was shattered, and everyone inside sustained serious injuries. The car was also violently spun around, and only by a miracle did it not flip over and remained on the road. Moreover, it continued to move and spin in the middle of the road. Eventually, it came to a stop after crashing into a sturdy guardrail. After a while, the culprits of the terrible accident began to approach the car to check if there were still living people inside. Fortunately, the child was unharmed as the woman had shielded him with her own body, thus saving his life. He tried to call out to his parents, who, on the contrary, had sustained serious injuries and were unconscious. The culprits of the accident tried to bring the father back to consciousness, so they began to slap and shake him. When the man regained consciousness, the question arose of what to do next. Also, the unknown people were behaving very strangely. Due to the darkness outside, it was hard to make out their faces, but it was clear that they were smiling and looking at the woman with the child. From their words, it became clear that they wanted to kill the woman, but they couldn't decide what to do with the child. Not wanting to deal with the woman, one of the unknowns presented her with a shovel to her neck and was about to kill her. He intended to do it quickly, and even the fact that the boy was watching didn't stop him. He only wished for the woman to go to heaven. Suddenly, Hyo Myong woke up. It was again his nightmarish dream. Meanwhile, the events shifted to Song Sik's home. His wife had prepared chicken broth for breakfast and wanted to treat her husband with it. But she witnessed that her husband was already drunk and started a scene about it. She was unhappy with the old man's behavior, especially since he wasn't reacting to her words at all. She was upset that he had started drinking again and had left home with a knife at night. She also accused him of negligence and irresponsibility towards his own life, as she was convinced that sooner or later he could get killed. Suddenly, the angry man looked at his wife. It was clear that he could no longer tolerate her words directed at him. But she continued, accusing him of constant conflicts with Hyunseop. But suddenly, the man cut her off. He flipped over the food she had prepared and began smashing everything in his path. But the woman couldn't understand such a reaction, as it was known that Hyunseop had previously defended him from their mother's wrath. However, Song-sik was convinced that his abuser had to face consequences for his actions. He also didn't want to give away his chickens anymore, and the elder, knowing what had happened, didn't intervene or resolve the issue. Unable to take it anymore, the man decided to leave home, remaining hungry. Meanwhile, the woman, incredibly anxious, began to apologize to her mother for her own behavior and Song-sik's behavior. In the meantime, the man managed to find a better place where he could be alone and think everything over. He continued to drink. Downing one bottle of alcohol after another, Song-sik sat alone on a bench in the park. He was very angry at everyone involved in his misery and planned to kill them all. Suddenly, he heard a very familiar voice. It was Ja-eun, who was casually walking through the park and ran into him. Immediately, she extended her basket to him, wanting to treat him. They were peaches, which she thought were fresh and very tasty, and she offered him to try them since the man had no snacks. But Song-sik asked where she was going, as it wasn't the way to her home. At that moment, she told him about the newcomer who had recently settled in their settlement and lived alone, so she wanted to treat him to food. The man continued to drink and stared at the girl's face. Suddenly, he didn't like the expression she had while looking at him, and he became very angry. But it wasn't like that. The girl was scared and thought he had just drunk too much. He also accused her of planning to give the peaches to someone who had lived in the settlement for less than a week. Suddenly, he grabbed a knife and intended to hurt the girl, convinced that she was also trying to provoke him. The girl, shocked by such behavior, jumped to her feet and tried to calm the man down. Her voice sounded uncertain, and she watched as the man began to approach her. Therefore, to avoid getting into a dangerous situation, she grabbed the food and was about to leave. However, suddenly, the man struck her with the knife and wounded her arm. Ja-eun dropped the basket of fruit and couldn't understand the reason for such behavior. But the man believed that the girl was simply ignoring him because of the unknown boy. He thought that since his arrival, everything in the settlement had become very strange. And suddenly, the man began to scream, blaming the hero for all the troubles. He felt it was his duty to get rid of him and save the entire settlement. Hearing this, Ja-eun became very frightened, as she didn't understand what could happen next. Suddenly, the psycho lunged at her. Grabbing her by the hair, he tried to catch her and stop her. But somehow the girl managed to break free. All that was left in Song-sik's hands was a clump of her hair. He promised that he would chase her relentlessly and had no intention of letting this go easily. The girl desperately started to run, trying to escape from the man. However, he didn't fall behind and continued to pursue her. He kept smiling and shouting at her, demanding that she stop and surrender. Fortunately, he was old, so he didn't have enough strength to catch up with her. Still, he didn't relent, and the girl understood that he had lost his mind and was ready to kill her. So, in order to save her life, she ran toward Hyo Myung's house. She hoped that the guy would be home and would let her in. Immediately, she started banging on the door and screaming frantically for him, hoping he would protect her. But no one answered, and she watched in horror as the deranged man got closer. It was clear that the girl had nowhere to run, and if Hyo Myung didn't come out, she would be left alone with a dangerous, armed criminal. Song-sik threatened that soon the girl would be heading to the heavens. He ignored her tears and pleas for him to leave her alone. Finally, he began to approach her. Ja-eun screamed desperately and started praying that the guy would hear her and save her. Suddenly, the crazed old man ran after the girl, wanting nothing more than to kill her. He began shouting as she irritated him, and soon she would die like all the others who had become his enemies. The girl understood that she was doomed and no longer expected help. Just then, out of nowhere, a hero appeared and kicked the man, managing to stop him. The guy showed up at the last moment and miraculously saved the girl from certain death. She couldn't believe her eyes. The guy had become her savior. Song-sik fell to the ground, feeling incredible pain all over his body. The hero, not understanding what was happening, asked why it was so noisy and why she had disturbed him. Then the girl explained that she could have become a victim of a madman, as he had injured her and was ready to slit her throat. Suddenly, the guy noticed the cut on her. He saw that she was very scared and was telling the truth as blood was flowing from her deep wound. Hyo Myong decided to examine the wound and help the injured girl. First, he wiped the blood with his own towel. He did this very carefully so as not to cause her more pain. Suddenly, he heard the voice of the Mad An, and it seemed that he recognized the guy and knew he was new. So he decided to kill him too and finally put an end to the madness that had taken over the settlement since his arrival. Hearing this, the guy exhaled heavily, realizing he had a new problem to deal with. The man was truly insane as he linked all the troubles in the settlement to the hero's arrival. Moreover, the guy hadn't expected to see him in such a state since morning. The guy thought the girl needed to go to the hospital to treat her wound. Suddenly, the man fell silent and became suspicious. He stood still, his head lowered. His eyes began to fill with blood, and he looked at the people in front of him with terrible malice. Suddenly, blood started pouring from his eyes. Soon, he couldn't stand still and lunged at the hero and Jaeun, swinging a knife. The hero, who was trying to stop the girl's bleeding, noticed the impending danger. He tried to protect himself and the girl's life, so he understood he needed to defend himself. Immediately, he tried to hit the man with the towel to knock him off balance. Besides, he knew that the old man had a broken nose, which was his weak spot, so a hit to the nose worked effectively. After that, the guy punched the man in the face. The kick was so strong that Song-sik began to lose his balance. Before long, he found himself back on the ground and couldn't get up for a long time. For a moment, the hero managed to stop him and save himself. But the old man didn't give up and tried to regain his composure and get back up. He groaned heavily and his face was battered and terribly swollen. However, when he finally managed to get up, the girl, with horror on her face, tried to alert the hero. Hyo Myong didn't want to harm the old man, who wasn't his enemy, but he left him no choice. He wanted to call for help and inform the other residents of the situation. But it was too late. The old man was about to attack again and stood silently, staring at them. Hyo Myong found it very strange to observe such behavior, as he didn't know if this could end and what was going on in the sick old man's head. Moreover, he didn't understand where he got the strength to stay on his feet. So he decided to attack first and was determined to end what had happened. Immediately, he began to quickly approach his opponent. After that, he struck him in the face with all his might. It seemed he was satisfied as everything was going as it should. Next, he was going to hit the man using a special martial art technique. However, he realized that it could harm the old man and ruin his health, so he just hit him with the towel. But the blow was also quite strong, causing him to lose his balance, and after a trip he ended up on the ground. Once again, the madman found himself on the ground with a broken nose and a swollen face. But he didn't even think of giving up, so he tried to get up again. His attempt was unsuccessful, as he had lost a lot of strength, and blood from his eyes and nose was flooding his face. The main hero was very determined and didn't want to let the old man go. He understood that the old man could come back and slit the girl's throat or his in the middle of the night. He decided to take matters into his own hands and was going to strangle the helpless man. So, throwing the towel around his neck, he began to squeeze with all his strength. But Song-sik resisted and tried to break free. He even managed to scratch the guy's face. In a fit of rage, the hero tried to strangle the old man even harder. Eventually, Song-sik's strength began to wane, his breathing became heavy, and his resistance weakened. The girl understood that the guy could kill him this way and tried to shout at him. But he didn't stop and continued to squeeze and choke the man. Finally, he felt satisfied and began to smile. And Song-sik, lacking air, lost consciousness and stopped resisting. Jaeun was very scared as despite what Song-sik had done, she didn't wish for his death. So, the hero released the man and stopped choking him, and his body fell to the ground. Finally, the guy could breathe a sigh of relief, as their confrontation could be considered over. After the man didn't respond, the girl ran to her savior. She was worried about his health and hoped that he wasn't injured. She also hoped that the old man was alive and that nothing would happen to him. However, Hyo Myong was angry with her as he didn't understand how it all started and what had really happened. And the frightened girl tried to explain how everything had unfolded. The thing was, Song-sik continued to attack even after he lost consciousness. Moreover, he aimed for the eyes even when he was being choked. The main hero had never encountered such situations before and didn't understand how this could happen. However, the girl realized with horror that the man could have been possessed by a spirit. But her version seemed like nonsense to the hero despite the fact that the girl had witnessed what had happened. The girl tried to convince the guy of the existence of ghosts, showing him her injury. She also tried to explain that there were indeed supernatural forces in the settlement that were very dangerous for ordinary people. And blood from her wound dripped onto the ground right at her feet. She didn't stop talking and said that there were an incredible number of ghosts. Suddenly, something truly incomprehensible began to happen with the bloodstain in front of her. Her head spun sharply, and she almost lost consciousness herself. And then she felt an overwhelming weakness and a sudden rush of air swept through her legs, causing her hair to helplessly flutter in the air. She also felt something strange, and some force began to pull her along. Moreover, she noticed something odd right behind her. So, she ran in that direction, trying to find out what was really happening. The guy couldn't understand anything and was shocked by what was happening. He even began to get angry at her for her behavior. Besides not believing a word about ghosts, he didn't understand what strange things were happening in the settlement. He wasn't sure he had his sanity intact, and with everything that had happened recently, he risked losing it completely. Overwhelmed by heavy thoughts, he also felt a sharp pain in his head and ringing in his ears, and to avoid falling, he had to hold onto the fence. He just wanted to be left alone and not bothered anymore. When the girl stopped in front of the place where the unknown force had led her, she saw nothing. But to make sure something mystical was happening, she began to dig into the ground beneath her. The guy, who was witnessing her incomprehensible behavior, was seriously nervous and even scared. However, the girl didn't listen to him and continued to dig. She felt that she was supposed to find something, and her vision was not simple. Finally, when the hole was deep enough, she began to feel some object under her fingers. Peering inside, she was shocked and genuinely terrified. What she found could forever change her life and the lives of those living in the settlement. Suddenly, she came to her senses and realized she remembered nothing. She was also stunned by what she had done. The girl was convinced she hadn't done anything, but the mud on her hands and the guy's words told a different story. She truly didn't understand how she managed to do this, especially to find the mysterious object. The object she found was a ritual of Azazel conducted since ancient times. However, the hero didn't understand how a jar wrapped in a strange ribbon could end up on his property. Moreover, he didn't know what such a strange find could mean. But the girl explained that the jar was meant for a ritual and she couldn't understand how it could have appeared in the guy's house. So, in order to rid the jar of any evil energy that might be in it, she planned to burn it. Suddenly, the angry guy approached the girl. He had a ton of questions and didn't want to waste time on things he didn't understand. So he struck the jar with all his might. Ja-eun couldn't withstand the strong blow and dropped the jar. It shattered as it wasn't sturdy, and Ja-eun, who was shocked by the guy's audacious behavior, began to yell at him. However, understanding the seriousness of the problem, she almost cried. The hero remained calm and didn't pay any attention to what had happened. Inside, he saw raw rice and a severed chicken head. The girl started screaming as now they had no way to burn the jar and all its contents. Moreover, she was angry at the guy for not understanding the seriousness of the problem and not believing her words. Additionally, he was planning to walk away to finally sort everything out and just wanted to mind his own business. Suddenly, at the sight of the broken jar, the girl noticed a horrifying sight. A mass of evil energy began to rise from the jar. After that, a large mass of dark energy entered the guy. And he, not understanding anything, didn't even notice how it happened. However, he felt an unpleasant chill throughout his body. His head spun and he didn't understand what was really happening. He only heard the girls scream and turned to her, asking what she wanted. And she, in turn, didn't understand how it all started and where the mass of dark energy had gone. After a while, the guy and the girl decided to return to the man, who continued to lie unconscious on the street. However, they were horrified to realize that he was no longer there. He could be anywhere, so the girl thought they should warn all the residents of the settlement, but the guy thought differently and wanted someone to check the girl's cut. He also wondered how the girl knew about the berry jar in his garden, but she didn't understand anything and denied everything. It seemed the hero began to suspect her, as she had previously placed a sacred talisman on him. The guy said it was very interesting to observe the events, and he didn't even notice how he was being watched. The man felt that he was about to be killed and soon he would die. So he decided to run away and leave the settlement to save his own life. Still, the people decided to hold another meeting to figure out what had really happened. The elder was going to listen to the victim and knew that the man had been waving a knife the day before. All the men gathered inside were ready to express their opinions about what had happened. However, everyone unanimously said that Song-sik couldn't have done such a thing and accused the girl and the hero of lying. Glancing at each other, Hyo Myong and Ja-eun realized they were left alone with their problems. Moreover, they were accused of lying, which was very insulting and unacceptable. The guy decided to act decisively and tried to prove the man's involvement in what had happened the day before. So, he grabbed the girl by the hand to show her injury and prove he was right. The elder immediately asked where Song-sik had been at that moment and why he wasn't at the meeting. But the hero replied that he was with him while he was treating Ja-eun's wound. Therefore, the elder ordered his subordinates to bring the suspect to him. Right away, Hyunseop volunteered to do it as he also felt no fondness for the old crook. However, it was unclear how the people were supposed to overcome the difficulties that had arisen in the settlement recently. Moreover, the suspect's wife tried to prove his innocence and vehemently denied any accusations against him. But her words meant nothing as Hyunseop and another man set off to search for the suspect. The hero couldn't calm down and kept raising the girl's hand, so everyone would finally notice her cut. This behavior surprised her. She hadn't expected him to help her, let alone continue to defend her after the incident. Next, the elder wanted to decide what to do with the criminal upon his return. But Ja-eun beat him to it and suggested calling the police. After all, she believed the old man's actions could be seen as an attempt on her life, and the matter was quite serious. Suddenly, she felt a strange chill spread through her body. It seemed she could no longer control her words and actions, as if something had taken over her. Meanwhile, the elder silently watched the girl, contemplating every word she said. But he couldn't refuse her, so he promised to do everything as she wished. Suddenly, the boy released the girl's hand when he realized the matter was settled. But then the girl changed her answer, saying that the settlement's affairs should be handled by her mother. She said it so uncertainly that it felt like she had been forced to say it. At that moment, the hero looked at her, confused about her stance, hoping the police would sort things out. After a while, the search for the criminal yielded no results. The meeting had already ended, but people weren't in a hurry to leave and lingered outside the building. The hero, unable to make sense of what was happening, hid or eavesdropped on the men's conversation. Suddenly, he spotted the elder and couldn't resist the tempting idea of eavesdropping on everything. He witnessed the suspect's wife trying to persuade the elder to pardon him. She was angry at the hero for the fact that the elder and all the other villagers believed him. But the man spoke of the chance the mother had given the criminal and how he hadn't taken it, continuing to commit crimes. However, the woman kept insisting and trying to save her husband. Finally, the elder replied that the only one to blame for what happened was Song-sik, who had lost his chance to redeem himself, and for his actions he deserved to be punished. The lady continued to try to justify her husband, believing he had already left the settlement. However, as was known, no one had ever succeeded in doing that. Having heard enough, the hero decided to take action and wasn't going to sit idly by. He resolutely decided to find the criminal quickly and tried to figure out what had happened. He knew nothing about the mother or why everyone was so afraid of her. Besides, he didn't believe in ghosts or any magical powers that Ja-eun constantly talked about. Meanwhile, it had grown dark in the settlement, and the search for the criminal was postponed until the next day. However, the suspect was trying to escape from the settlement. He was doing everything he could to get away and stay alive, avoiding his punishment. But in horror, he realized he was going in circles and couldn't find his way out of the forest. Suddenly, the exhausted old man stumbled over a rock. Painfully hitting the ground, he found himself on the ground. His weak body wouldn't cooperate, and out of sheer fear and a thirst for life, he kept crawling. After that, he realized that all his efforts were in vain and he was doomed. He understood that there was no sense in his actions as he hadn't even managed to reach the main road all day. He was sick and old, believing he remained his mother's son. He comforted himself, convinced that his mother couldn't be so cruel as to abandon him. He also reassured himself that he had been a good son and had done everything he was asked to do. Suddenly he began to smile and took a deep breath. It seemed he started to understand, and his self-reassurance was doing him good. But nearby, he heard indistinct footsteps and became very frightened. Looking in the direction of the sound, he realized someone was approaching him. It was the hero to whom the old man spoke about unfinished business in the settlement and tried to return. But the boy wasn't listening. He was talking about needing to do something for him. Suddenly, he pulled out his weapon. At that moment, everything became clear to Song-sik. So he began to prepare for the end of his life. Hyo Myong was convinced that the man didn't deserve to live and should end up in hell after death. Song-sik insisted that his mind was clear and he understood how much pain his body was in. He also realized that the hero intended to harm him, so the old man tried to stop him. Moreover, he didn't understand what harm he could do to the hero and thought the girl was the cause of it all. He tried to prevent the conflict and wanted the boy to take him home. He was also convinced that the hero was following his mother's orders. But Hyo Myong ignored the man's words and wasn't going to waste any more time on talk. However, the man continued, saying that the boy couldn't have found him in the mountains by himself and couldn't know his whereabouts. This made the hero laugh. In response, he received a similar question about how the old man ended up in the forest. Also, the old man had to take responsibility for what happened that morning, as he had dared to attack unarmed people. Unable to bear the accusations, the man began to scream that he remembered nothing. But the boy didn't believe a word he said. He could see that the old man was very scared and slowly began to approach him. The old man, in turn, stood still and didn't react at all. It seemed he had resigned himself to his fate and was ready for whatever the young man had planned. Suddenly, the boy cut the man's arm with his own weapon. After that, he asked how he was feeling and if he was having fun. From the incredible pain, the old man began to scream, trying to free himself. But the boy wouldn't let him do that and was ready for any turn of events. Meanwhile, Hyunseop and his partner were trying to find the fugitive. They were also searching the mountains, knowing he wouldn't escape from there. Moreover, they believed this task wasn't particularly difficult and would soon encounter him. Suddenly, nearby, they heard a terrible scream of pain from the suspect they had been trying to find for so long. Immediately, the men began to listen closely, trying to determine from which direction it was coming. Having pinpointed the approximate location of the victim, they rushed to find him. Meanwhile, the confrontation between the hero and Song-sik continued, and the old man was doing everything he could to break free from the boy. But the hero knew the man was exhausted and was taking his time following his trail. He remained incredibly calm, having firmly decided to take revenge on the man for everything he had done. Song-sik, for his part, was convinced that the boy was simply following No Suk-dae's orders and blamed him for what was happening. However, Hyo Myong no longer listened to him and didn't understand what he meant at all. But the old man continued to accuse him of serving the elder and carrying out his orders. Eventually, he managed to anger the boy, who was ready to end it all. The boy tried to speed up to catch up with his victim. And when he succeeded, he attempted to strike. Feeling the wound, the old man froze, his eyes wide with horror. He had received a serious injury to his back and began to bleed out slowly. At first, in a state of shock, he understood nothing. But after a while, his whole body felt incredible pain. He tried to speak, but his words came out as incoherent mumbling. But to ensure no one heard them, the boy tried to cover Song-sik's mouth with his hand, squeezing it with all his strength. He knew that a scream could cause him problems, as no one was supposed to know his intentions. He planned to pull the axe out of the victim's body and warned the man not to scream. Moreover, the hero didn't let go of his victim, and to make sure he understood, he ordered him to nod. When Song-sik did as the hero commanded, he tried to throw him to the ground and tripped him. As the man fell to the ground, the boy simultaneously yanked the axe from his back. After the fall, the victim felt particularly weak and, experiencing incredible pain, struggled to breathe. Moreover, he was trying to get up and was putting in an incredible amount of effort to do so. Hyo Myong was touched by his determination and struggle. Suddenly, he pointed to a tree just a few meters away from them. He wanted his victim to reach the tree on his own, and if he managed to do that, he planned to let him go. So, after a while, he gave the command to start, marking a new beginning in the fight for survival. Without wasting a second and exerting all his strength, the old man tried to rise. He succeeded, and his thirst for life was something incredible that truly impressed the young man. But the man wasn't going anywhere. Instead, he was pleading with his mother for help and apologizing for doubting her. He also wished death upon the main character, who was tormenting the mother's child. After that, he turned around and calmly headed toward the tree. As he turned his back to the main character, a large wound on his back was revealed. Suddenly, the main character spoke up. The thing was, there were certain limitations in his game, and the man could die before he reached the tree. Hearing this, the victim froze in place, unable to move. At that moment, Song-sik began to call the main character the harbinger of death. However, the main character couldn't understand what the man meant or what he was trying to say. The old man lay on the ground, motionless. The boy wanted to torment his victim further, but it seemed he wasn't the only one who had come for the old man's life. Behind him, the hero heard a sound. It was two men trying to make out something in the pitch-black darkness. But the boy realized he didn't have time to hide the man's body, and all he could do was hide in some nearby bushes to avoid being seen. In fact, the men had also heard the sound and were trying to determine its source. They were stumbling through the forest almost blindly as nothing was visible in the complete darkness. However, once they reached an open area, they managed to find the corpse of the dead old man, who was already in the afterlife. Hyunseop seemed pleased to see his fierce enemy dead. Suddenly his companion placed his own weapon on the ground. He remained serious while Hyunseop was celebrating and talking about how he felt this was bound to happen since their nighttime knife fight. Suddenly his companion delivered an incredibly strong punch right to his face. This sent Hyunseop flying backward a good distance. He landed on the ground and couldn't regain his composure for a while, feeling immense pain and shock from the brutal blow. The man insisted that he should have shown respect for the dead as their mother was watching over them. They also needed to pray and inform the village elder about what had happened. It seemed Hyunseop acknowledged his guilt and agreed with his companion's words. At the same time, the men began to pray, trying to atone for their sins. And Hyunseop, who was bleeding, had no choice but to join in the prayer as well. However, his companion insisted even more, leaving him no choice. Soon, raising his hands to the sky, Hyunseop began to recite the words of the prayer. The two stood over the corpse of the dead man, hands raised, murmuring incomprehensible words of prayer. At that moment, the hero realized that the murder of the man could be suspected from his wound if the police were called. Therefore, to save his own life and ensure his safety, he thought about getting rid of all the witnesses. He also understood that he had played with fire and his adventure could end very badly for him. Meanwhile, the men called the elder and informed him that they had found the dead body of the old man. However, at that point, it was already clear that the old man had not died of natural causes and was likely murdered. After the elder's words, he promised to handle everything in the best way possible. Placing his hand on the corpse's head, he intended to fulfill No Sukdae's request. Hyunseop asked what exactly needed to be done. He understood that the dead body needed to be burned or the soul needed to be appeased. This way, they could eliminate unnecessary noise and make it seem as if no one had ever found the man. Suddenly, the main character realized that this looked exactly like tampering with a crime scene, destroying evidence, and disposing of a body. Analyzing this, he understood that the men were also committing a terrible crime. Meanwhile, the boy was planning to return to the settlement after everything that had happened. He seemed very satisfied and even hummed some incomprehensible melody to himself. Suddenly, nearby, under the tree, he saw a girl. It seemed very strange that she was outside at such a late hour, especially after what had just happened. So he decided to ask her what she was doing out there and why she was standing under the tree. But in turn, the girl also asked the boy what he was up to which he replied that he had been in town taking care of his own business. It seemed the girl had been waiting for him, and realizing this, the hero immediately asked her directly. However, she quickly began to deny any involvement and insisted that it wasn't what he thought. In reality, her mind was racing with thoughts and she had decided to take a walk to distract herself somehow. She also noticed that the hero seemed very cheerful and it appeared something pleasant had happened to him. Suddenly, the boy fell silent and made an unclear gesture with his fingers. However, he then replied that his mood had lifted after meeting her. His words made the girl blush, and in response, he asked again what she was doing outside. At that moment, the girl tried to explain. It seemed her thoughts were troubling her and she was very nervous. She was tormented by the fact that she constantly looked rather strange. After all that had happened, she hadn't even called the police and didn't want to accuse her attacker. Suddenly, she realized she had said too much, and after that, she felt even worse. Lowering her head in front of the boy, she turned away, not wanting to show her emotions. But the main character understood everything as he continued to watch her behavior closely. Suddenly, Ja-eun decided to leave and insisted that it was already late. But as she was leaving, the main character replied that he didn't think she was strange. He wanted to explain that everyone had their reasons for behaving a certain way and he understood her perfectly because he was the same. Thanking him, the girl didn't dare to turn back to him and continued to walk away. She seemed very frightened and kept telling herself that what she had seen was just a figment of her imagination. So she saw that the spirit of the dead old man was bound to the body of the main character. Meanwhile, Hyunseop and his brother had built a fire and were trying to fulfill the last wishes of the deceased. The work was done and the men reported everything to the elder, but he remained unsatisfied. It seemed there was a will from the mother regarding the murder of the old man, but everything felt too eerie and strange. The men also had too many doubts about the truth of the situation, but the elder ordered them to return to the settlement once everything was ready. Hyunseop also didn't understand the elder's true intentions, but he continued to do his job and follow orders. After everything was burned, they needed to collect the ashes, climb to the top of the hill, and scatter them over the settlement. However, the men were still anxious and troubled by the question of who the real murderer of the man was. Immediately, they thought of the main character, who had recently settled in the settlement. No one doubted his involvement. After all, in light of recent events, it could be concluded that there had been a serious conflict between them, and the boy had every motive to commit the crime. But suddenly, the older brother turned to Hyunseop. He placed a hand on his shoulder and was about to say something. The thing was, their work didn't allow for unnecessary questions and they needed to do everything quickly and efficiently. Therefore, the topic was closed, as it wasn't part of their duties, and the police should handle the search for the murderer. So, after everything that had happened, they decided to have a drink later. Meanwhile, the elder was in his temple, preparing to perform a new prayer. He was addressing the statue and extending his hands toward it. He was tormented by the question of who that man really was, the one he couldn't even see. He was determined to see the one who was so cruel and had allowed himself to commit such a brutal act against the mother's child. He reached out his hands to the sculpture again and asked to see the face of that person. Suddenly, a true miracle occurred as he managed to glimpse a vision. Before him sat the deceased, next to the body of a chicken with its head cut off, holding a knife in his hands. His face, hands, and the murder weapon were covered in blood, and there was no doubt that he was the one who did it. He was also grinning maniacally, which left no doubt that he was a madman. After that, he took the animal's head in his own hand. Then he tossed the head into a bowl and began to sprinkle it with dry rice. He also added drops of blood from the knife into the pot with rice and the head and started mixing everything thoroughly. His eyes were wild and the man was incredibly pleased with what he had done. He was preparing for a terrible crime and it became clear that he was involved in a horrific curse ritual. When everything was ready, Song-sik began to laugh maniacally. After witnessing this, No-suk-dae couldn't regain his composure for a long time. But it seemed this was the section he wanted to look into. However, he was aware of the deceased's use of raw rice and chicken heads. But for whom and against whom was such a terrible curse made? Suddenly, the elder froze in place as a terrifying idea struck him. He thought that the mother could have used the man for her horrific ritual and then disposed of his body and all evidence. Suddenly, on her way home, the girl was approached by an unknown stranger. He was following her at night and wanted to walk her home despite her resistance and refusal. But the stranger insisted that it was dangerous to walk alone at such a late hour. The hand he placed on the girl's shoulder was quickly shrugged off, and she pushed him away with all her strength. But it seemed the unknown man only enjoyed this more, smiling at her despite scaring her badly. He also realized that his actions might look very bad and vulgar from the outside. Moreover, he felt very sad when the girl behaved that way as he was trying to win her over. The girl quickly said goodbye to the boy and tried to leave him as fast as possible. Furthermore, this kind of situation had been repeating constantly and she was already tired of pushing him away. But at the last moment he grabbed her by the arm and started pulling her toward him, which was an unacceptable decision on his part. The boy insisted that he was ready to take care of her and her sick father. But Ja-eun wasn't listening, she just wanted to get home as quickly as possible. Suddenly, the stranger heard a voice that sounded quite familiar to him. To his side, he saw the girl's father, who was running toward him and shouting at that very moment. He looked very angry and was holding a broom which could easily smash the suitor's head. Seeing her father, Ja-eun began to scream and tried to stop him as she knew better than anyone how this could end. The stranger, having no choice, didn't want to make the situation any more tense. So he quickly turned around and decided to leave, not wanting to create problems for either himself or the girl. Moreover, he knew that the girl's father was unstable and didn't want to cross his path any further. The girl, approaching her father, asked how he had managed to find her and what he was doing outside at such a late hour. As it turned out, he wanted to eat chocolate cookies, but he needed his daughter's permission for that, so he went looking for her. Hearing this, the girl hugged her father. She was touched by his gesture. So, she allowed him to eat no more than one chocolate cookie. Meanwhile, the main character returned to the spot where the pot with the curse had been found. Examining the place, he wondered how the girl could have learned about the setup and who could have left it there. He didn't like what was happening in the settlement as the recent events were very strange and made him anxious. However, he had no options and the only thing he could do was accept what was happening. Moreover, he began to suspect Song-sik, as besides him, he didn't understand who else could have done such a thing. But the constant thoughts exhausted him, and he decided to rest. Suddenly, he heard the voice of a woman who had woken up under the fence and was trying to peek inside. She knew the hero was home, so she didn't stop shouting until he came out onto the street. After a while, she started banging on the gate and could easily break it down. Moreover, she was angry at the boy for responding and ignoring her. Seeing the woman and realizing she wouldn't calm down, the boy tried to understand her reason for visiting and who she was. As it turned out, she was Song-sik's wife and was looking for her husband. Opening the gate, the hero informed her that he didn't know anything and couldn't help her. However, such a response didn't calm the woman. On the contrary, upon seeing his face, she became very frightened. The thing was, the hero couldn't stop laughing and continued to do so even in front of her. But realizing the absurdity of the situation, the boy tried to explain that he was laughing at the fact that the woman was shouting and standing in front of his house at such a late hour. He also recalled the situation with the girl and her trauma, accusing the woman of not believing her words and that no one besides him had defended her or even asked what had really happened. Listening to him, the woman grew angrier and angrier. But when her patience snapped, she grabbed the boy's clothes with both hands and held him tightly, not letting go. She was taken aback by his audacity and how he tried to play the victim, bringing up the girl's trauma. She couldn't believe that for him, the girl's trauma was far more important than her husband's disappearance. However, the woman's words had no effect on the main character and he continued to laugh. He tried to push her hands away from him and kept mocking her husband. From his words, it was clear he thought the man was foolish and sick. After all, he had been wandering around the village lately, waving a knife and clearly wanting to kill someone. If he had reacted wrongly, Ja-eun could have become his victim along with himself. So instead of being so proud and stubborn, he suggested the woman apologize for her husband and back off. It seemed his words had an effect and the woman started to apologize. Tearfully, she said she was very sorry, but she still wanted to find her husband no matter what. The guy, exhaling heavily, replied that he last saw her husband on the day of their confrontation and after he left the house he was no longer on the street. But the woman kept pressing for more, increasingly irritating the main character. Besides, he tried not to give the impression that he knew everything and was involved in the disappearance. Meanwhile, the woman left Hyo Myong's house and he sat in his bathroom reflecting on the recent events that had unfolded. Looking in the mirror, he noticed something strange on his clothes. It became clear that there were bloodstains on his shirt, but he didn't know whose they were. Suddenly, he caught sight of a strange silhouette behind him. He realized someone was watching him and that person was right outside the window. The guy quickly turned around to catch a glimpse of who it really was. However, he saw no one in his window. He thought the person might have hidden in the yard, not wanting to reveal themselves. But there was no one in the yard either. Besides, the suspect would have to be very tall to reach the window. So finding nothing, the guy decided he must have imagined it, probably due to exhaustion. Meanwhile, events shifted to Song-sik's house where his wife was sleeping. But she tossed and turned, unable to fall asleep. She noticed blood on the guy's clothes and the thought that it might be her husband's blood wouldn't let her rest. She was also very angry at the main character, which kept her on edge. The woman was deeply worried about her husband, especially since he hadn't returned home. Moreover, during their last encounter, they had fought and he had been very drunk. Such thoughts could drive her mad, but there was nothing she could do about it. Meanwhile, the two brothers, having climbed a mountain, began scattering the ashes of the deceased elder over the settlement, as the village chief had instructed. They believed that after death, the man could find peace and enter a better world. When the task was completed, they decided to call the chief and inform him of everything. But the conversation with him was very tense and a new responsibility weighed on the men. The chief was very concerned that the men were the only witnesses to the elder's death and had found his body. Therefore, no one in the settlement should suspect what had really happened. At the cost of their own lives, the men had to keep silent and tell no one about it. The next day, a new meeting was held in the settlement regarding Song-sik's disappearance. There were many people present and the girl realized that the main character had arrived first. But he replied that he was just curious about what had really happened to the missing person and how his mother, whom everyone was talking about, might be involved. However, it seemed his words sounded uncertain and the girl regarded him with skepticism. After a while, No Suk-dae began his speech. He spoke about the missing man and how he had indeed been wandering around the settlement. trying to kill innocent people. Moreover, the elder had rejected the mother's mercy, attacking the girl, and then fled the settlement. But since he was a member of their community, the search for him hadn't stopped and many people were involved. Suddenly, one of the brothers who had been searching for him the previous night began to speak. He assured everyone that they had scoured the entire area and still hadn't been able to find Song-sik. Hearing this, the main character began to smile as he was the only one who knew what had really happened. He was also constantly watching the dead man's wife. He suspected that soon her patience would wear thin and she would unleash her anger on everyone. Especially after the news that the old man hadn't been found. The woman nervously began to clench her fists, barely able to contain her rage. Unable to hold back any longer, tears in her eyes, she began to shout at everyone present, unable to believe that even after so much effort and searching, her husband could just vanish. Hearing this, Hyunseop lifted his gaze and looked directly into the poor woman's face. His brother did the same, looking at the woman with a puzzled expression. The chief also joined them, raising his eyes to the grieving woman, who continued to cry but could do nothing. Only the main character held himself together. He looked very tired and was the only one who had known everything from the very beginning. The woman, who kept falling to the ground and getting back up, said that he had last said goodbye to her before going somewhere. It was very strange as she hadn't seen him at all since then and hadn't heard anything about him. Hyunseop wanted to approach the poor woman and try to comfort her. However, the chief managed to grab him by the leg and stop him at the last moment. It seemed Hyunseop realized his mistake, as this could cast doubt on the truth of his own words. So slowly he began to turn back to his place. The woman couldn't calm down and continued to cry. Suddenly, she turned and looked at the main character, who was sitting in the crowd and staring right into her eyes. At the top of her lungs, she screamed that he was the murderer. At that moment, most people turned to look at Hyo Myong. Everyone was staring at the guy who had been accused of a brutal crime. The chief also joined the crowd and began searching for Hyo Myong with his gaze. The woman continued, saying she had seen blood on his clothes, so she was sure he was the criminal. Suddenly, Ja-eun looked at the main character in shock. She couldn't believe such an accusation. But the guy remained calm and didn't want to listen to the accusations directed at him. Besides, the woman had apologized to him just the night before, which he pointed out to the crowd. So he stood up and was about to leave, as he felt he had had enough. But the woman, again accusing him, tried to stop him, calling him a coward. Hyo Myong saw no reason to stay there any longer as he vehemently denied his guilt and wouldn't accept any accusations. The woman, who had also stood up, asked whose blood it really was on his clothes. But the guy didn't consider the blood on his clothes a serious accusation. Moreover, he accused the woman of lying, as that could also lead to serious punishment. At that moment, the woman calmed down a bit, realizing that the evidence of the hero's involvement wasn't really substantial. Suddenly, Ja-eun, who had been sitting quietly until then, began to fidget and she couldn't help but draw attention to herself. She stood up and shouted to the whole room that it wasn't Song-sik's blood. But the old woman looked at her in surprise as she hadn't expected the girl to defend the main character. Ja-eun began to explain that when the elder attacked her, Hyo Myong had tried to protect her, and during the struggle, the elder had managed to injure him, so it could have been Hyo Myong's blood. As proof, she pointed out the injury on the guy's chin. It seemed she was speaking convincingly, and this greatly helped the main character. Moreover, she put the woman in a very uncomfortable position, and the chief, who had been closely watching the developments, suddenly became very serious. The girl's words indeed seemed very logical to him, and he appeared convinced that the hero wasn't involved. Instead, he asked the woman what she thought about it. However, she couldn't respond. The chief understood the woman's feelings and tried to share her pain. He bowed to her and said he wouldn't allow anyone to treat new family members the way she had. Furthermore, he suspected the woman was possessed by evil spirits, as she wouldn't behave like that, and he intended to pray for her to her mother. Seoko and Hyunseop were to continue the search for the missing man as the chief had promised. With that, the meeting could be considered over, and No Suk-dae announced that everyone was free to go. So people began to disperse, leaving the room one by one. The girl who approached the main character said he owed her. But her behavior irritated the man, who had tried to get her attention the night before and had run into her father. Meanwhile, the chief and the two brothers remained in the room, and the man ordered them to search the main character's house. It seemed he suspected Hyo Myong, and truly terrible events awaited ahead. Meanwhile, events shifted to the police station. A lot of time had passed since the last murder, and the case hadn't progressed, with the killer still at large. The policeman wanted to punish the two detectives for making the case public but failing to find the murderer after all this time. And the guys, with no choice, had to endure it all. Despite only 10 days having passed, the investigator didn't believe the guys could uncover the real criminal. His trust had been shaken and he considered their actions disgraceful. Moreover, they had no information besides a photo of the suspect from a surveillance camera. But the guys were convinced that the best way to stop the murders was to present their society, and that's what they wanted to do. However, the investigators and police faced immense pressure after turning the case into a public investigation and putting it on display. At that moment it was the loudest case, so criticism from others was entirely expected. But the guys assured that their boss had agreed to this risky move and was not against trying to prevent future murders through publicizing the news. Still, the guys had to put in all their efforts to find the likely murderer, as the management was already waiting for the investigation to conclude. For this, all possible surveillance cameras near the crime scene were checked, but no one resembling the suspicious man in the photo could be found, and tracking him wasn't easy. Furthermore, the chief hoped to find the suspect through a backpack or a piece of clothing. But this step was anticipated and people with similar clothing were checked and detained. The police had no choice but to restart their search from scratch and try to find more evidence. So ahead lay hard work and relentless searching. After a while, the guys discussed their future plan of action in their office. They were going to call in the girl who was the daughter of the deceased, but they quickly abandoned that idea as it seemed too much. Even with the boss's instructions, this idea felt abnormal and too traumatic for the child herself. Moreover, the men didn't know what questions could be asked of the child, as everything had ended before she arrived, and her parents were already dead. Suddenly, someone entered the guy's office. Kong turned his head to the guest. As it turned out, they had brought in the daughter of the victims. But it was so unexpected for the men that Kong, the lead detective, stood up from his chair. It was clear that the girl was genuinely nervous. She said she had only learned about the incident a few days ago. Therefore, she hoped she could help find the murderer who took her parents away. Delighted that the girl had expressed a desire to share everything, the detective wasted no time and began asking her questions. Gathering her strength, the tearful girl informed them that one of her father's cars was missing and she believed the murderer might have escaped in it from the crime scene. This detail surprised the detective, as he hadn't thought the murdered man could have two cars. And this detail hadn't been considered during the investigation. Meanwhile, events shifted back to the settlement, where the main character was sorting his belongings at home. But he didn't even notice how a suspicious person was once again watching him. He took off the bracelet from his wrist and left it in the house. After that, he locked everything up and got ready to leave. Meanwhile, in the chief's temple, active planning for the search of the guy's house was underway. It became clear that the men had been watching him for several days and discovered that after his morning workout he hadn't been doing much, making it impossible to search his house. It seemed this news didn't impress No Suk Dae much. So he pondered what could be done next. But there was another possibility. The thing was, the men needed to stray from the righteous path, but such behavior was considered particularly dangerous in their settlement. And the chief, who was about to light a cigarette, confirmed the men's words, saying it was indeed the worst thing they could do in their settlement. After all, people who acted this way could take their own lives, burn alive, or they could be possessed by spirits that could simply kill a person. The brothers were shocked by the elder's stories and asked if anyone had ever strayed from the path and where he had gotten such information. The man's mother had told him about it. Moreover, she had shown that someone had killed Song Sik, but they hadn't been able to see the face. And suddenly, Hyunseop realized why they needed to search the guy's house and began to suspect him even more of the crime. However, the chief wasn't sure about the guy's involvement in the crime. He just hoped that none of his people had done it, which is why he ordered the search to start at his house as the dead man's wife had yelled at him. Moreover, No Suk Dae hadn't done anything wrong and hadn't particularly strayed from the right path. After these words, Hyunseop began to get very nervous. He hoped there was a way to stop this somehow. And as it turned out, such a possibility did exist. According to the chief, it was possible when a person was ready to kill someone themselves, as it all began with intent. So this managed to calm the men down a bit. Furthermore, the chief was convinced that Song Sik was already in paradise. And he didn't even doubt that the man had been murdered. The chief was firmly convinced of this. At the same time, he intended to give the men a box when they were about to leave. Opening it, the men saw an enormous amount of money inside, which was even impossible to count. The first thing that came to the men's minds was to visit an expensive restaurant and have a nice meal. The brothers pondered the idea of where to spend their own money. After taking another look at the stack of cash and assessing the amount, they reached an agreement. They decided to relax that evening. Meanwhile, the scene shifted to the city, far from their settlement. The main character was in a grocery store planning to buy 2 boxes of snacks. But when he heard the price, he realized he had spent all his savings. At that moment, he began rummaging through his bag, trying to find his money to pay for the items. However, his actions caught the attention of the cashier, who couldn't take his eyes off him. He was so fixated on the boy that he didn't even notice when he found the money and handed it over. Meanwhile, the hero left the store. The cashier, noticing a stack of cash in his bag, called someone to report it. He also mentioned that he had never seen the boy before. It became clear that he had arranged to rob the main character, and it was about to happen soon. Meanwhile, the detectives returned to the police station to continue their investigation. They were too tired and downcast to jump right back into work. So, they decided to grab a bite to eat first before resuming their search. Besides, there was a great restaurant nearby that served spicy pork, which the detectives loved. They also contemplated the girl's words and the 2 cars belonging to the victim, leading them to think that the man might have been involved in some business dealings. As a result, he might have had a conflict with someone which could have led to the murder of his family. Hyunseop and Seoko weren't wasting any time either and were already in the city. Suddenly, Seoko asked the taxi driver to turn back and stop. However, his brother didn't understand why he was against his friend's decision since they had just arrived. But when they glanced in the mirror, they saw the main character walking down the sidewalk toward them. Suddenly, he raised his hand, preparing to call the same taxi the men were already in. But the car didn't stop and continued on its way just as the brothers had instructed from inside. They thought it was the perfect opportunity to search his house while he was away. The boy was left standing in the middle of the street, frustrated that he would have to walk quite a distance. With few options, he decided to stroll around the city. Suddenly, Detective Kong spotted the main character across the street. He began to closely watch him and his actions. Meanwhile, Hyo Myong had no idea what awaited him ahead. He walked calmly, contemplating his next moves without suspecting a thing. The lead detective started to feel noticeably anxious. What he was seeing raised a lot of questions, and he didn't like it at all. Meanwhile, the main character continued walking down the street. Suddenly, he reached a dark and empty alley and decided to turn in, hoping to cut through. Besides, it seemed like the perfect spot for what he had in mind and why he had come to the city. But he wasn't alone in that alley. A group of men had been tailing him the whole time. It was the same cashier from the store, along with his friends, who wanted to rob the boy and take all his money. As it turned out, the main character knew he was being followed and had intentionally chosen the dark alley to set up an ambush. Immediately, the men demanded his bag and all his personal belongings, including the cash. But even with their threats, they couldn't intimidate the boy, who remained incredibly calm and even smiled. He remarked that he had encountered a lot of rude people lately, which really annoyed him. Then, he started stretching, causing laughter and a flurry of emotions among his opponents. But in reality, the boy was preparing for a fight, trying to distract the men before he struck. Suddenly, he delivered a blow to the neck of the closest thug. After that, he grabbed the man by the neck, not allowing him to break free or retreat to safety. An incredibly precise and powerful upward strike dealt a significant blow to his opponent, staggering him. Moreover, he tripped him to ensure he fell to the ground. At that moment, after a quick series of 2 strikes, the thug found himself on the ground, unable to act. He could only scream in pain and rage. He also ordered the other men to attack and let the main character escape with the loot. But Hyo Myong didn't let him finish and delivered another blow that knocked the man unconscious. He simply waited to see who would be next and felt no nerves at all. The thugs realized the boy was no ordinary kid and could easily handle all of them. So, they pulled out a knife and began threatening him again, trying to take his bag of money, promising to let him go afterward. However, the main character continued to mock them, saying that the situation was getting tense with the knife. But he wasn't scared at all and wasn't going to listen to them. Suddenly, a rough male voice came from behind them on the street. As it turned out, it was a detective who had been following the gang, realizing something suspicious was going on. Now the threats were directed at him, and the thugs promised to deal with him if he didn't leave the crime scene. But the detective stated that his principles didn't allow him to stand by while such things happened. At that moment, the thugs realized that the boy who had found them might actually be with the police. Showing his badge, he confirmed the thug's words. They were involved in a group attack with aggravating circumstances and had threatened the main character while trying to take his personal belongings and money. They were all arrested for attempting to commit a crime as a group. Suddenly, one of the thugs, scared, decided to try to escape and ran straight at the detective. But he met him with a hard blow and continued to remind him that anything the men said could be used against them in court. After taking down another thug, he talked about the lawyer the criminals could face during the trial. He also mentioned that he wouldn't have to use physical force if they had just listened and followed all the orders. The main character, who was just observing all the events, remained calm and didn't react to what was happening. He decided to leave the crime scene without waiting to see how it would all end. However, the police officer who had come to help him didn't understand this behavior. He tried to shout after him and stop him, but it didn't yield any results. Meanwhile, the scene shifted back to the settlement at the main character's house. Sayako and Hyunseop had already arrived at the settlement and were ready to start searching his house. But they were trying to come up with a plan and a way to get inside without making noise. The older brother wanted to boost Hyunseop over the fence and then climb over himself to open the door from the inside. Making sure no one was around, they began to climb. Within seconds, Hyunseop was inside and looking around. He tried to take in his surroundings and carefully inspect all the objects around him for anything suspicious. But finding nothing, he simply opened the gate for Sayako. Both men were inside and ready to start searching the house, not wanting to waste any time. Moreover, the brothers didn't even notice that the house was completely empty and that a bracelet left by the boy was lying at the entrance. Meanwhile, the main character was returning to the settlement, having called a taxi for himself. Sitting in the back of the car, he thought about what had happened and what role the detective was supposed to play in his life. The detective's involvement and sudden appearance seemed very strange to the boy, making him anxious. Additionally, he had a very bad feeling that wouldn't let him rest. He had no idea that a search was already underway in his house, with two men trying to find any evidence that could prove his innocence in the horrific crime. But aside from some rags and odd items, they found nothing. Suddenly, Hyunseop felt a hand on his neck. He was startled and froze in place, not thinking it could be his brother, who was supposed to be on watch to ensure the boy didn't return. He calmed down and asked the man to let him go, but he continued his search. However, Sayako was unhappy that his friend had made a complete mess in the house which could give away their presence. So, he ordered him to put everything back as it was and to clean up before the main character returned. Besides, it was already late and they had very little time to get everything done. Therefore, Sayako went back outside to keep watch while his partner continued searching and started cleaning up the house. The door closed and the man was left alone in the house. Rubbing his neck, he smiled. He considered his brother a real jerk, but kept it a secret since he was much stronger than him. Meanwhile, the main character continued to approach the settlement and would soon be home. Suddenly, the driver began to brake, informing the hero that there had been an accident or some other incident on the road. But the boy wasn't surprised. He already knew the reason for the stop. Ahead, police officers were standing with flashing lights, indicating that the road might be closed. Hyo Myong suddenly ordered his driver to stop for a moment. This made the driver think the boy just wanted to check out what had happened. Besides, the main character simply wanted to smoke and take a little break. The road ahead was indeed closed and police officers were checking every vehicle without exception. Meanwhile, a crane was trying to retrieve a submerged car from the river that had somehow ended up there. Watching this, the hero remained completely calm and didn't react to what was happening. Meanwhile, the taxi driver, astonished, observed all the events. The police officer was keeping an eye on their actions, ordering them not to approach the scene of the incident as it was dangerous. In the meantime, the boy finished his cigarette. Turning to the taxi driver, he informed him that he was ready to go. Immediately, the taxi driver set off, asking the boy for the exact address of where he wanted to go. But the hero didn't respond, making the driver anxious. Suddenly, the boy shouted at the top of his lungs, startling the driver so much that he jumped in his seat. Meanwhile, the detective arrived at the scene where the car had been found. He was investigating the murder case and this detail was very important. He couldn't understand how the car had been found as there were no surveillance cameras nearby and how the car ended up in the water was a mystery. Therefore, he praised his colleagues for their hard work and such an important discovery. The taxi continued to move and soon the boy would be home. Suddenly, he began to laugh hysterically, which further frightened the driver. The thing was, the main character was just a few meters away from the detective who was trying to find him and he didn't suspect a thing. Meanwhile, the search in the main character's house continued. Hyunseop was very angry that he had to clean up in the main character's house since he never did that in his own home. But he understood that he was to blame for what he was doing now and he had no time, so everything had to be done quickly and efficiently without unnecessary chatter. And the hero had already arrived in the settlement. The car stopped in the middle of the street, just short of his house. Also, Ja-eun was passing by, completely unaware that the main character was in the car that had stopped next to her. So, as she walked by, she didn't pay any attention to the taxi or who was inside. But suddenly, she heard the boy's voice asking her if her ice cream was good and what she was doing out so late. In reality, she was very happy to see him and asked where he had been and why he had such a big bag. As it turned out, he had gone to the city for shopping and stocked up on essentials. He also had a gift for the girl that he bought at one of the city stores. Seeing his package, the girl was pleasantly surprised and very curious. The boy quickly left her and headed home, wanting to rest after a long day and trip. He brought her a lot of sweets from the city. And she, with a full bag of sweets, blushed and was impressed by the boy's behavior. At the same time, Seiko arrived at the elder's house to report on the results of the search of the main character's house. They found nothing and couldn't raise any suspicions about the boys. The elder was shocked, as he had expected more and had high hopes for the search. But he was glad that the hero was in no way involved in the crime and didn't seem too disappointed. Still, he was tormented by the question of what had really happened to the old man and who his murderer was. And judging by his injury, one could logically conclude that he had been killed with a heavy blow from an axe right in the back. These words made no Sukde ponder. It seemed he understood everything and began to laugh hysterically. The man who witnessed everything and saw his behavior couldn't respond and didn't know how to react to such a thing. However, No Sukde noticed that Hyunseop was not with him and inquired where he had disappeared to and why he hadn't come to his house. Then he learned that his partner had stayed in the main character's house to clean up the mess he had made and ordered him to take care of it immediately. However, the main character's house was clean and tidy. Hyunseop turned off the lights, cleaned up after himself, and was preparing to leave the house. However, at that very moment, the main character was just nearby. But he wasn't in a hurry to enter the house. Instead, he crouched down by the gate. The rubber band he had intentionally left the day before was not where he expected it to be, and he realized someone had been inside the house. Hyunseop was completely oblivious and had already started to relax. But suddenly, he heard the gate to the street creaking open. This terrified him as he understood that the main character could be returning. Therefore, he could be in serious trouble and he needed to think of something fast. Slowly, the guy walked through his own yard, searching for clues about someone's visit. The first thing that caught his eye was a pair of shoes left by his front door. This led him to think that there might still be people inside and he could catch them off guard. Realizing the seriousness of his predicament, Hyunseop tried to come up with a plan and looked for a place to hide. But it was already too late as the main character had entered the house. After checking a few rooms, he walked into the living room. Opening the door, he began to carefully scan the area, hoping to spot the intruder. But nothing suspicious caught his eye, and he didn't see anyone. He started to look around again, searching for signs on the carpet or any other suspicious items. Then, in the adjacent room, he heard a suspicious sound that piqued his interest. Without wasting any time, the guy rushed in, trying to catch the thief. Meanwhile, Hyunseop, who had managed to buy himself a little time, was trying to squeeze through the bathroom window. The main character noticed him and lunged to grab him, determined not to let him escape his house. However, he didn't realize it was Hyunseop yet as he couldn't see his face clearly. He almost managed to catch him, but at the last moment the man squeezed through the narrow window and fled the house. The drop was quite high, and he landed painfully on the hard concrete. Despite the sharp pain from the fall, he couldn't afford to wait. He had to keep running. So, getting back on his feet, he tried to make his way to the exit. However, he realized he had wasted too much time when he saw a guy coming out of the house and quickly approaching him. Understanding the seriousness of the situation, the man started to run, trying to shake off his pursuer. But Hyo Myung was much faster and in far better shape than his opponent. So, he quickly closed the gap on the fleeing man. Hyunseop had no chance of escaping, and it became clear that the hero would catch up to him very soon. In fact, it happened so quickly that the man didn't even manage to reach the street. With all his strength, Hyo Myung pulled him back. He threw him to the ground behind him. The thief lay on the ground while the guy, tying back his hair, tried to figure out the reason for his visit and what he was looking for in his house. But it was clear that the elder had believed the murdered woman and sent them to search, suspecting the main character of the crime, although he had no evidence. He began to approach the man, continuing to talk about the nonsense the woman had told him. Grabbing him by the neck, Hyo Myong started to choke the man. Moreover, he knew he hadn't been liked from the start, and his brazen behavior had raised many questions. However, no one should behave like that and so boldly enter his house. With each passing second, he tightened his grip on the man's neck, easily capable of choking him. The man, in turn, tried to call for help and break free, but he didn't have enough strength. After a while, he began to lose consciousness as his air supply was cut off. The guy was satisfied with his work, as the man had lost consciousness and wasn't responding at all. Meanwhile, the investigators continued to examine the found car, trying to find new evidence and connect it to the recent murder. They were very attentive to every detail, looking for something new. In their profession, it was also important to remain cool-headed and assess the situation clearly. It was clear that the criminals might have known that there were no cameras within a kilometer radius, which is why they chose such a spot to dispose of the car. But it was unclear where the killer could have gone next. It became evident that the detectives were returning to the place where they had started, as all leads had dried up. They needed to talk to the victim's daughter again and find out why her father had been driving a car with fake plates. The case was very complicated, and they needed to think carefully to understand where to go next. The detective seemed very serious, as this could be the toughest case of his life. But suddenly, a road sign caught his attention, marking several towns. This sparked an interesting thought in his mind. Meanwhile, the elder ordered Sayako to return to the main character's house and bring his friend back. Leaving the house, the man noticed Min-soo, who wanted to visit the elder because he had an important conversation to have. So, upon learning that he was home, Min-soo walked inside. Immediately, he saw No Suk-dae in the yard, the very person he was looking for. No Suk-dae hadn't been expecting a guest and was surprised by the man's arrival and the fact that he had business with him. Min-soo wanted to talk and had a few questions for him. Most importantly, he wanted to pass something on to his mom. Hearing this, the elder became much more serious and his expression changed. He immediately allowed the man to come in and invited him inside his house. He made the man wait inside while he prepared to make an important call, not wanting him to witness the conversation. As it turned out, the elder was calling a man named Park. He invited him to stop by for a bit as he also wanted to talk to him. Meanwhile, the main character continued to choke Hyunseop. He kept smiling and talking to the man, asking if he really wanted to live and how much he valued his life. Suddenly, his hands began to tremble. His eyes were watering profusely, and it was clear he wouldn't be able to hold on much longer. So, sensing that the situation was becoming quite tense and dangerous, the main character released him and warned that he wasn't planning to kill him. His action could be seen as a warning, and he threatened him with death next time. But Hyunseop, catching his breath, replied that there would be serious consequences for his actions and that he would have to face punishment. The main character ignored him, forcing him to get up and get out of his house. Just then, someone's foot flew right into his face. The blow was so strong that it knocked the guy back a few meters. It was Sayako, who had returned with his friend and witnessed what was happening. Wiping blood from his face, Hyo Myong wasn't about to back down easily. But the man continued to ask questions and threaten him. He promised to beat the guy up badly since he had nearly killed his brother. Hyo Myong, however, was confident he could easily defeat him, so he remained calm and didn't rise to the provocation. Meanwhile, the scene shifted to Ja-eun, where her father was sitting and enjoying cookies that his daughter had allowed him to eat. But he was hiding from her, fearing she might take away his sweets. However, that wasn't the case, and the girl wasn't planning to do that at all. She tried to reassure her father and promised she wouldn't take his cookies away. After all, she had her own treats, which she showed him through the bag. At that moment, she pulled out a chocolate bar and proudly displayed it to her father. In turn, the father was thrilled by the whole bag of goodies and asked his daughter to share with him. Even though she had given him cookies, he also wanted chocolate. Smiling, the daughter teased her father and didn't want to share with him. She looked very pleased and genuinely happy that the hero had given her such a gift, one she hadn't even expected. Meanwhile, the scene shifted to a local store. Deo walked in very angry because the girl kept pushing him away. His mother worked in the store and was furious with him for being gone so long and not helping her with everything. Instead, the boy asked if Ja-eun had come into the store. This only served to further upset his mother, as he was always thinking only of her and hadn't even asked how his own mother was doing. The girl came in every few days to get cookies for her father and, as it turned out, had been in the store about 10 minutes ago. Not wanting to linger in the store and argue with his mother, the boy decided to go home. His thoughts were consumed by the girl and he believed she was simply avoiding him since he had never managed to run into her at the store. Lost in his thoughts, he became so angry that he threw away his food without even taking a bite. Minsu witnessed the spectacle but pretended not to notice anything. An angry Deo asked where he was headed and where he had been. The man pretended to be happy to see him and gladly agreed to chat. However, the boy understood that on the side from which the man had come, no one ever walked, and what he was doing there was a mystery. But it became clear that the elder lived on that side, and the man could be his guest. As it turned out, the man had also received a package of money from the elder, which seemed very suspicious. Suddenly, the boy began to behave strangely, patting the man on the shoulder, saying how cool he was for finally being able to make a choice. However, this behavior angered him and he pushed Deo away. His words had genuinely infuriated him and he barely restrained himself from using force against the boy. He had to leave the boy and tears began to flow down his face. But he felt powerless to act. Deo understood that his behavior was just a game and deep down he hated the man and wished him nothing but harm. Meanwhile, the fight in the main character's yard continued. Sayako kept beating him and the boy couldn't retaliate due to the uneven match. Sayako was trying to take revenge on the hero for choking his friend, but he didn't give in and continued to resist. Moreover, the boy didn't respond to his questions, which only further enraged the man. He didn't see his fault in the situation, as criminals had broken into his home and were searching for suspicious items. At that moment, he decided to fight back and charged straight at his opponent. Gathering his strength, he threw a punch trying to hit Sayako. He attempted to kick him in the leg, but it had no effect. The giant seemed to feel nothing and continued to stand his ground. Hyo Myong couldn't understand how someone could be so strong and why his punch hadn't landed. Hyunseop, who was watching what was happening, realized that the main character was in for a brutal beating, and it amused him greatly. Suddenly, Sayako prepared to strike and swung hard. But the boy managed to anticipate this and dodge. At the same time, he was getting ready to counterattack. And that moment turned out to be perfect as the hero managed to hit his opponent in the most painful and sensitive spot. The man's face contorted from the blow and he tried to endure the excruciating pain that overwhelmed his body. Moreover, he grabbed the main character by the hair. Pulling him away, he prepared to strike. Once again, the main character took a devastating blow, leaving his face covered in bruises and blood. After being knocked back a few meters, he continued to lie on the ground. Sayako, stepping closer, grabbed him by the hair again and lifted him up in front of him. The boy had no strength left and couldn't resist. All he could do was accept and endure the new blows. And the man, taking advantage of his strength compared to the boy, continued to beat him. Several punches rained down on the boy's head. Hyunseop continued to smile, genuinely enjoying what was happening. Finally, the man realized he had inflicted enough damage and left the hero alone. Everything was over, and there was no sense in continuing the fight, so they decided to leave. Hyo Myong was left alone in his yard with terrible wounds and blood on his body and clothes. He tried not to lose consciousness. He also understood that this was just the beginning, and that thought sparked an incredible fit of laughter in him. He laughed so hard that despite the pain and wounds, he couldn't stop. As each day the events in the settlement became more and more interesting. Leaving the main character's house, the men heard his laughter and thought they might have gone a bit too far, as he was acting like a madman. Hyunseop was very pleased with what had happened and tried to keep up with his friend. He praised him and said it was much easier for him to watch the beaten boy and see how much pain and difficulty he was in. However, he was convinced that it wasn't enough and that they needed to beat him much harder. And as a sign of gratitude, he didn't touch his friend's shoulder and thanked him again for saving him. But suddenly, Sayako felt an incredible pain. He held onto the spot where the hero had hit him. He could no longer tolerate his friend's chatter and stopped him, saying they needed to go to the elder quickly. He also recalled how hard and accurately the boy had managed to hit him, and that was what made it so difficult for him at that moment. The pain was bothering him so much that he could barely move his legs and nearly collapsed to the ground. The scene shifted back to the police station. The detective who entered the office began praising his team for a job well done. The guy sitting at the desk, engrossed in his work, didn't even notice him or recognize his boss. Kong complimented him for being so focused on his tasks that he didn't see the person who walked in. But the guy really didn't expect to see the director, especially since he hadn't been warned about the visit. They started chatting about work, their achievements, and how long it had been since they last saw each other. However, Kong didn't have time for personal matters. He was trying to crack what he believed was the toughest case yet. Moreover, 3 men were about to be brought into the station whom he had managed to apprehend the day before for robbing the main character. It was clear that they had been caught right after the attack even without an investigation since their guilt was so obvious. The detective was eager to talk to those thugs being brought into the station. But his friend misunderstood him as he didn't know what could be discussed with those criminals. Meanwhile, the beaten Hyo Myong sat outside his house smoking. He was stunned by the brute's strength and realized he wouldn't have been able to handle him with just his fists. Suddenly, he noticed a very strange detail on his own house. One board in the ceiling wasn't nailed down properly and could fall off. This irritated him greatly, so he decided to try to fix the problem somehow. Jumping up, he tried to hammer it back in with his fist. But he quickly realized that was a bad idea. The board completely detached and nearly knocked him out as it fell to the ground. Letting out a heavy sigh, he understood that was a mistake and now he'd have to repair what was broken. Additionally, another suspicious object fell out with the board hidden in the ceiling. The unclear item was wrapped up and looked like an ordinary pile of papers or documents. Wondering where it came from, the guy started fixing the roof and putting the board back in place. Just then, someone knocked on the gate. He realized someone had come to see him, so he had to temporarily put the repairs on hold. Immediately, he went to the gate to open it and see who it might be. It turned out to be Ja-eun, who had heard about his run-in with the thugs. Seeing his face, she became very worried and started to fret about his health. But he assured her he was fine and felt better than ever. Instead, the woman noticed he hadn't even treated his wounds. So she brought a first aid kit with her and wanted to help him. She smiled kindly at him and prepared to get to work. Realizing he had no choice, he decided to agree. Right away, the girl stuck a bunch of bandages on his body and tried to treat all his injuries. After the procedure, his face was almost completely covered in stickers and bandages, making him look quite funny. The ointment and band-aids she applied to his bruises and cuts were supposed to help him. But the guy was surprised at how she found out what had happened. Although he understood that news about the incident in the settlement had spread quickly, and surprisingly he managed to stay alive after the encounter with such a strong enemy. Besides, in the small settlement, everyone knew everything about everyone and news traveled fast. This was because only a few small families lived in the settlement, so information spread quickly. She compared the settlement to a tree, with all the branches growing from the trunk, which was represented by the head elder. To prevent future problems, she advised the guy not to make enemies and try to befriend others. Her words made him think. He realized she might be right, and there was no point in fighting with the residents, so he promised himself to try. Meanwhile, the detective finally got to meet the thugs and started talking to them. They insisted they decided to rob the main character because they saw a large stack of cash in his bag. Moreover, one of the guys was acting very aggressively and didn't understand why they were locked up. The cop promised to let them go after they honestly answered a few of his questions. He confessed to the thugs that there was one detail that was bothering him. Kong admitted he had never met that guy before, especially not with a stack of cash. He held a photo of the suspect in his hand and was about to show it to the guys in the cage. He also confessed that the suspect could have committed a serious crime, and they couldn't find him anywhere. Still, he showed them the photo. The guys began to examine the suspect's photo closely, but they couldn't find any common details to connect the two people. The detective was convinced that, by the texture, the person in the photo resembled the guy they attacked. Meanwhile, regular meetings were taking place in the settlement, attended by all the residents. The elder announced that the discussion was over, and anyone who wanted could go home and attend to their own business. Some people had already gotten used to the main character's absence, so they simply didn't pay attention to his absence. The elder was convinced that he just didn't want to interact with them and was trying to build a wall between himself and the other people in the settlement. Moreover, he wasn't trying to do anything for the good of the settlement, and people were convinced there was no point in keeping him around. The best option was to just kick him out. However, No Suk-dae couldn't dictate the fates of the people who already lived in the village, so that option wasn't feasible. Jong tried to convince him that he actually had every reason to do so and could do it at any moment. People began to prepare among themselves and secretly established a connection between the disappearance of the old man and the arrival of the newcomer in the settlement. Moreover, all the troubles that began to occur in the village were linked to his presence. Despite the meeting having long been concluded and the elder announcing it, people continued to sit there and talk among themselves. No Suk-dae suspected that people were worried about what was happening and needed to address the issue. A girl who was part of the conversation was very nervous and couldn't handle the tense atmosphere. Suddenly, footsteps were heard at the door. It became clear that someone had arrived at the meeting, albeit late. When the door to the room opened, everyone saw Hyo Myong standing there. The residents of the settlement were very surprised. They looked at the guy with skepticism, interpreting his actions as a new provocation. The guy understood how people felt about him. However, he announced that he was ready to change and start working for the good of their shared home. The thing was, a few days ago he had promised himself he would do this. The girl was very happy to hear this news, as now he could befriend the residents and nothing would threaten him. However, Jaeun was already planning to leave since she had a lot of her own things to do. The guy thanked her for her help. As a farewell, she gave him her charming smile. And then she disappeared, leaving the main character alone with his thoughts. The guy understood that after getting closer to the other residents, it would be much easier for him, especially since he already knew a lot about the village, having explored it thoroughly during his walks. Moreover, the discovery in his roof included documents and bank accounts, and he couldn't figure out how they ended up there. Plus, his curiosity was driving him crazy. Standing before the crowd, the main character pondered where to start his path to reconciliation. It seemed that only Jaeun was glad to see him and greeted him. But No Suk-dae sensed something strange in his behavior, as the guy had previously rejected a similar offer. It seemed he had some sort of plan he was preparing for. However, he immediately dismissed such assumptions. Besides, he had an alibi. After all, he was the first one accused of murdering the sick old man. Also, his house had been turned upside down and searched, which was very humiliating and degrading. And it seemed to him that it was all because he was the newcomer in the settlement, and they wanted to pin all the troubles happening around on him. Understanding that the guy was telling the truth, the elder apologized for what had happened, as the missing man had been his close friend, and he couldn't calm himself. But the main character understood how deceitfully the elder had lied to his people, as the body of the man had been burned on his orders. No Suk-dae continued to say that he should play a certain role in the life of the settlement to finally be accepted as a legitimate resident. The hero added that he really wanted to find common ground with everyone. Suddenly, for some unclear reason, the elder crossed his fingers. Perhaps it was some sort of ritual, or maybe he was just trying to lie again. But in the end, he agreed and allowed the guy to patrol the settlement with his subordinates. These conditions completely satisfied him. That evening, the guy was supposed to start patrolling the outskirts of the settlement and already allowed himself to be a bit late, which annoyed his new colleagues. After what had happened, it was hard to imagine how they would find common ground and work together on tasks. Moreover, it was unclear why the elder decided to put everyone on patrol together instead of dividing the duties among them. Most likely, there were certain reasons for that which no one knew about. After a while, the main character finally arrived at the meeting place with his new colleagues. He wanted them to bring him up to speed and tell him what he needed to do. Right away, he was met with a wave of negativity from Hyun-seop, who accused him of being rude and of being late. But Seoko agreed to explain everything. The men set off down the road together. Surprisingly, Hyo Myong even apologized for his tardiness, which was something incredible for him. But Seoko didn't like that the men were standing around doing nothing, so he ordered them to follow him again. Eventually, everyone agreed. They headed to an unknown place along the road, shining their flashlights. Every evening, they needed to patrol the settlement and check if everything was all right, and also see if anyone from outside had gotten in. Outsiders were viewed with great suspicion in the village, as everyone was very skeptical about their presence. And for that reason, the guy tried to argue that a person could be a distant relative of a certain resident. This helped him criticize their approach. Along the way, they encountered Deo, the same unfortunate lover whose face resembled that of a pig. They shone the light directly in his face, forcing him to shield himself from the bright light. This made Hyun-seop laugh, and he mocked Deo. Suddenly, Deo started talking about how there were no problems with the goods, but abruptly fell silent. Hyun-seop noticed this and tried to get him to keep talking and tell everything as it was. However, the guy wanted to discuss it later, in private, as it seemed he didn't trust the main character and thought he might hear too much. But it was clear that the men were trying to hide something and seemed to be involved in something illegal. So, after saying goodbye, the men went their separate ways. Hyun-seop and Seoko planned to go check a house nearby but didn't want to take the main character with them, ordering him to wait outside. In that house lay a sick resident of the settlement who needed constant supervision, and if his words were to be believed, that's what they did every evening. But everything had to be done quickly because they still needed to patrol the entire settlement. So, leaving the guy behind, they headed toward the house. Hyo Myung pretended everything was fine and that he trusted them. But he knew the men were lying to him and hiding something terrible from him and the entire settlement. The scariest part was that the elder himself could be at the head of it all, giving the men all the orders. The hero couldn't wait for the resolution but had to pretend he was on their side. After a while, they were already inside the house and quickly came back out. As it turned out, that was the only house that needed to be checked in that manner, and then they had to continue checking the settlement. The guys were about to move on, but Hyo Myung couldn't stop thinking and analyzing what had happened. He believed the men had something to hide, but he couldn't decipher their secrets yet. After some time, they had patrolled the entire settlement and the job could be considered complete, which turned out to be much easier than it had seemed at first. After the workday, they could go home, which was what Hyo Myung planned to do. However, the men weren't in a hurry to leave and were supposed to meet with a guy who looked like a pig to discuss the details of the case. Still, Hyunseop felt very tired and planned to leave them and head home to rest. And one last time, as a farewell, he shot a glance at the main character from the corner of his eye. Meanwhile, Seoko met with his accomplice. The guy offered him coffee, but it was unclear why he had kept quiet about the goods in the presence of the main character. It seemed something was off, and his behavior made it easy to understand that. As it turned out, there were actually no goods, as none of the people responsible for the delivery were responding. Seoko didn't like this at all, and what he heard made him seriously anxious. In the same house that the men had checked, there lay a man who couldn't sleep. The old man's whole body ached and itched incredibly. The pain was so intense that the poor guy nearly scratched the skin off his neck, arms, and other parts. Suddenly, someone entered the house where the old man was. It was the main character, who had come back to check what was really happening in that house he hadn't been allowed to enter. Smiling, he greeted the old man. As it turned out, Deo had been trying to reach the couriers for several days, but it was all in vain. Seoko noticeably began to get anxious and tried to hold himself back from snapping at the guy. Rising to his feet, he was furious that he was only hearing about this now, as it might already be too late to fix anything. Deo should have reported everything right away, as that was his main responsibility. Besides, no one else knew about the shipment delay, not even the elder. However, talking about it wouldn't help anymore. They needed to call an emergency meeting to decide what to do next. So, Deo was left standing there with spilled coffee on his head. All he could do was fume at the big guy and curse him. Meanwhile, the boy's visit to the sick old man had terrified him, as he hadn't expected anyone to come to his house at such a late hour. He could barely see and didn't know who it was, but he begged for someone to scratch his back more than anything in the world. But when the boy didn't respond, he started screaming at the top of his lungs, as the pain was so unbearable that his hands trembled and his whole body convulsed in agony. The boy had a backpack but realized he wouldn't need it. The state of the sick man made it clear he was suffering from intense itching, yet his skin remained clean. The sick man was convinced that his illness was divine punishment for his sins or any other crimes he had committed. Hearing this, the hero became curious about what he could have done to deserve such harsh punishment. The sick man believed that the tree he had once cut down was the source of his misfortunes and had affected his health. This was what angered the gods, and he had to suffer until the end of his days. Suddenly, the boy thought of the sacred tree at the edge of the settlement. He noticed it had been cut down even before he arrived. Moreover, he was holding a pillow that was covered in some strange substance. The sick man continued to scream and blame himself for cutting down the tree despite all the warnings and prohibitions. His grandmother Jong had warned him about it, but that hadn't stopped him either. Now he felt so terrible that he was ready to claw his own eyes out and tear at his body. The boy stepped closer to the man. He pressed the end of the pillow to the man's mouth, triggering an incredible cough along with bleeding. Suddenly, the man stopped resisting and calmed down. It seemed he was beginning to die or was already dead. As a result, he no longer breathed and lay dead in his own bed. The boy, with cold-blooded cruelty, committed his crime again. However, he thought the old man had simply lost consciousness. Putting on gloves, he believed everything was under control. But when the old man didn't respond, the boy started to panic and decided to check his breathing. His horror knew no bounds when he realized the man wasn't breathing. The next day, events unfolded at the elder's house. Deo was apologizing while sitting in some storage room. The men involved in the matter gathered to punish the one who had messed everything up. They wanted him to be responsible for the delivery of goods, and even with such an easy task, he had failed. Deo needed to report on the state of the deal, and if something went wrong, he was supposed to inform them immediately. Moreover, they were beating him and continuing to interrogate him. They hit him even though he wasn't resisting or trying to escape. Deo didn't deny his guilt. He truly felt sorry, but he was the one they could unleash all their rage on. He promised to fix everything next time and not to make such a mistake again. He also begged for another chance. He was ready to do anything just to end the torture. Suddenly, one of the men involved in the deal entered the room. He announced that the elder was approaching. At that moment, everyone froze, and Hyunseop stopped with his hand suspended in the air. In his presence, no one dared to act out, and everyone immediately calmed down. Upon entering, the man announced that the punishment could be concluded, and Deo got what he deserved. His appearance was like a breath of fresh air for the victim. The failure repeated that he had tried to contact the couriers, but they hadn't responded for 5 days and hadn't even called back. No Suk-dae felt sorry for him and said that anyone could make mistakes, and such things could happen to anyone. In any case, it was the last delivery, and the goods wouldn't just disappear, so there was no reason for the man to worry. But what interested him most was why the couriers hadn't responded and what could have caused such behavior. No Suk-dae insisted that the boy find out everything. The way he pitifully leaned down to his feet greatly amused him. Suddenly, a police car drove into the settlement. This terrified everyone present and made the men anxious. However, after checking all the phones, it became clear that no one had received a call from the police, and their appearance raised many questions. Therefore, Youngsem decided to go out and check the goods they had to ensure everything was all right. The elder thanked him for his diligence and caution and let him go. He also ordered Hyunseop to find out why the police had come to the settlement. Events were unfolding too rapidly, which could lead to many questions. After all, there had been no warning about their arrival, and it could mean something very serious had happened. Along with the police, an ambulance arrived, and the doctors took away the body covered with a blanket. It turned out that Grandma Jong had found the body of the murdered sick man and immediately called for an ambulance. The circumstances of the death were unknown, and that was what the medics needed to find out. That day, it was the woman's turn to visit the sick man, and when she saw him in such a state, she was terrified. She didn't want to tell the detective anything about the man or what illness he had, but she was convinced that he had been murdered on purpose. She started to worry that she would be suspected of everything. Suddenly, she cried out in a pleading voice that there shouldn't be any investigation. However, the woman's version sounded unconvincing, and the detective had many questions for her. She insisted that the culprit was still in the settlement and was walking around freely. Moreover, she claimed she had her suspicions. Hyunseop, who was nearby, had heard enough and was planning to leave the scene so no one would see him or pay attention to him. He immediately called the elder and informed him of the reason for the police and doctor's arrival. Additionally, he was convinced that an investigation was underway regarding Song-sik's disappearance, and it was his wife who had called them. Hearing this, the elder ordered him to return immediately. The man was breathing heavily and was incredibly anxious, as now he faced problems because of the woman and the unfortunate old man whose death everyone had forgotten. Suddenly, Jong grabbed the detective by the arm and started pulling him along. She led him to some house and wouldn't stop screaming, pointing her finger at him. She also began to pound her chest in a fit of rage that completely consumed her. The woman was convinced that the probable murderer of her husband and the poor sick man lived there. The detective's heart sank at her words, as the accusation was very serious. Meanwhile, the main character was not home, as he was, as usual, out for his morning run. His mind was filled with various thoughts about ghosts, setups, murders, and everything happening in the settlement. The image of the sick old man he had killed kept surfacing in his mind. This wouldn't let him rest and genuinely troubled him. Even the morning routine he tried to use to distract himself didn't help. Suddenly, he recalled the sick man's words about divine punishment and couldn't believe that this could be why he had fallen so gravely ill and spent the last days of his life in agony. But quickly shaking off those thoughts from his mind, he continued running. By his house, a woman was already standing with a police officer trying to shout to him. However, the detective tried to convince her that she had no right to treat the boy that way. After all, she had just accused him of murder without any evidence, and as it was known, such unfounded accusations could lead to consequences. Hearing the boy's words that the main character was innocent, she stopped and turned sharply to the investigator. This irritated her greatly, as deep down she blamed Hyo Myong for all her troubles. But indeed, the investigation hadn't even started and there was no evidence against him. Suddenly, Hyo Myong himself appeared, addressing the woman, saying she had no right to accuse him and make him guilty. He immediately introduced himself to the detective and stated that he was the owner of the house they were trying to enter. It turned out that the officer was Sergeant Song Hyun-ho from the police department. The police had been informed about a death in the settlement, so he had come to deal with the issue. Finally, the heroes understood why so many police officers and medics were in the settlement. Suddenly, the woman approached the hero closely and openly accused him of all the deaths that had occurred in the settlement recently. She didn't care that this was baseless and did it based on her own beliefs. But even this didn't make the main character change his calm and mysterious expression. Meanwhile, Hyun-seop arrived at the elder's house just as he had been ordered over the phone. Inside sat the elder and everyone else already waiting for his arrival. Things were looking grim, as it was the first time in a long while that the police were in the settlement. Moreover, Hyun-seop misunderstood everything and thought that it was because of them that all this was happening. However, he knew that the police had gone to the main character's house and because of that their situation was slightly better. Still, he was convinced that the elder should have called him. But No Suk-dae didn't understand why that was so necessary. In reality, the man was just afraid for his own skin, as just yesterday they had searched his house together, which could raise suspicions. No Suk-dae wasn't rushing to conclusions as he believed they had nothing to fear since they hadn't killed anyone, especially the sick old man. However, this didn't calm him at all and he continued to insist on his point. The elder noticed his anxiety and made a remark about it. Suddenly, Taegil interrupted the conversation. He believed that the woman could tell the investigators about the death and the mysterious disappearance of her husband. And if that were true, the police would start searching the mountain for his body. The elder couldn't disagree with the validity of his words. He understood that this wouldn't end well for them and then everything would become clear to everyone. Immediately, the elder picked up the phone. He dialed an unknown number, and a very polite conversation ensued. Suddenly, he invited the unknown person to come visit him for a consultation. Meanwhile, events continued to unfold actively and a real scandal erupted near the main character's house. The detective could no longer tolerate the woman's screams and accusations. Honestly, he was trying to calm her down as he didn't understand what had caused her aggression. He asked the woman if she was really sure of her accusations as it wasn't clear what had prompted them. He also inquired whether any murder weapon, the body of the deceased, or any other evidence had been found. However, the woman was very surprised when she heard about her husband's body. Deep down, she was convinced he could still be alive and this fact further shook her faith. Realizing her mistake, the investigator tried to explain that the presence of a body could significantly simplify the process of finding the culprit. But then, the main character replied that the search for the body was being conducted by the settlement elder, so the case could be classified as a disappearance rather than a murder. He also mentioned that Jong had been accusing him of murders for quite some time, ever since her missing husband had threatened him and the girl with a knife. After that incident, he had fled, and no one had seen him since. After his words, the woman's face darkened, as she realized what the situation could now look like. The boy continued, adding that under such circumstances, the old man could simply be a fugitive who was afraid of facing the consequences of his actions. He also wondered if he could sue the woman for false accusations against him, and if there was indeed such a possibility, he was ready to do it. Suddenly, the woman began to scream that he had been patrolling the settlement the night before, clinging to this fact as her last hope. She connected this with the sick man's death and tried to justify her words with it. However, the boy added that the two men who had also been patrolling with him hadn't allowed him to enter that house. It also became known that Hyun-seop and Seoko were inside. The boy had simply been standing outside, doing nothing while waiting for them. Now, it looked like the woman was trying to accuse 3 people at once and there was no logic in her words. However, the detective was already confused and, stopping the conversation, tried to reach a specific and logical conclusion. He concluded that there had been an armed attack by the missing man on the 2 and that he had disappeared afterward. The hero had been patrolling the street and when his 2 friends had gone inside the house, he had remained outside. By morning, a corpse had been found in that very house. So the case looked serious and required investigation. They needed to find out the reason for the man's disappearance and the armed attack with a knife. And why this hadn't been reported earlier. The detective stood before the people, waiting for explanations. The woman began to visibly panic. She understood that by doing this, she was putting all the residents of the settlement at risk. The boy replied that he hadn't been harmed, so he hadn't contacted the police. But without letting him finish, The woman pushed the police officer away so he could finally get to work. She demanded that the boy be locked up as soon as possible. Therefore, she almost forcibly began to drive the detective away, but in reality, she understood the difficult position she had put herself in. And now her actions could harm the entire settlement. The hero, however, remained satisfied as he understood that he was in a winning position and there was no real evidence of his involvement. The woman, stepping aside with the police officer, tried to convince him of her innocence, but he accused her of not letting the young man speak, leaving him without enough information. However, the detective needed to find out what the guy had been up to after the patrol. Suddenly, the man turned on his voice recorder, as the woman's words had raised doubts in his mind. She claimed he should have gone back to talk to the main character. Moreover, her confidence that the hero might be involved in the crime put him on alert. He continued to ask for details, curious about what events could have led her to make such accusations against the main character. Suddenly, stopping in front of the officer, the woman replied that the suspect had told her himself. It sounded very strange coming from her, as it was known that no murderer would confess to their crime, especially to a close person of their victim. Additionally, the woman insisted that after her husband's death, he became a ghost and told her what had happened, even naming his killer. That was enough for the man to turn off the recording. He exhaled heavily, as dealing with ghosts and such claims was a first for him. He decided not to torture himself with nonsensical chatter and returned to the crime scene for further investigation. However, the woman immediately accused him of not trusting her. She began repeating her words about how no one believed her and started scratching her own neck. Suddenly, without even realizing it, she began to slowly peel her own skin off due to an intense itch. Meanwhile, an unknown man visited No Sukde, with whom he had a phone conversation the day before. He handed him a talisman he had written himself, hoping it would help the guy in the suit harness his mother's strength. Therefore, the man in the suit felt satisfied and thought he had no reason to worry. For this, he gave the elder a bundle of cash as payment for his services. The guy also mentioned he was surprised by the call, as it was very rare, so he thought something might have happened to the elder. But No Sukde reassured him that everything was fine, although they had recently lost one of the residents who had been chronically ill. Because of this, the police had come to them, which could cause problems not only for him and his subjects but also for other residents. Moreover, his mother was very displeased that a stranger had appeared in the village. The more strangers there were, the angrier his mother became, and the elder worried that her wrath might spill over onto the unknown guy. The guy, who was a congressman, was scared and knew he must not anger his mother, as it could end very badly for him. But first, they wanted to resolve their issues with the main character, as that was where everything had started. Sayako, standing at the exit of the room, listened to the men's conversation and was surprised by the seriousness of what was happening. As the guy was leaving, he exchanged words with him at the door. Sayako handed him a box that, as was known, had been given by the elder. He wanted to support the congressman in his new job, and his gift could greatly help with that. It seemed the unknown man understood what was inside and willingly accepted the box. Sayako just smiled at him, saying nothing in return. Meanwhile, Jong was already at home, preparing food. However, the feeling of itchiness wouldn't leave her. Moreover, it was so intense that even the boiling dish couldn't stop her from scratching. Despite the food being ruined, the woman couldn't stop clawing at her skin. Terrible wounds and deep scratches appeared on her arms and neck. A week later, events shifted to the police station. Song Hyunho was trying to convince his superiors of the need for an autopsy on the dead man, also mentioning the disappearance of the elder, who had been waving a knife. Additionally, he suspected that the missing man might have been a criminal, which is why he was hiding. However, his superiors didn't like his work, as finding people and sending them home wasn't part of his job description. Therefore, an argument broke out between them, and it seemed he was forbidden from pursuing that investigation. After all, as they said, there were much more important matters, and besides, the previous murderer hadn't been found yet, so all efforts needed to be focused on that search. Returning to his office, Song Hyunho pondered his next steps and what he needed to do to solve the complex case before him. Suddenly, his phone rang. It was the chief detective calling him to his office. He summoned him to a cafe that was quite far from the station. The thing was, he just wanted to see him. Moreover, he had an important conversation to have and was afraid someone might overhear them. He began to talk about a submerged car they had managed to find and retrieve the day before. However, they hadn't found any clues, as the criminal had perfectly cleaned the interior afterward. This led to the thought that the criminal might be a professional and had prepared very well for the murder. Furthermore, Song Hyun-ho mentioned a recent murder notification where the victim had coughed up blood and died. He was 56 years old, and according to locals, he had been sick for a long time, and during the examination at the house, only fingerprints of the residents were found. The man's body had many scars, which seemed strange. It was also established that no relatives of the deceased could be found in the settlement. All they managed to find was information about his parents, who had long been dead. Song Hyun-ho was convinced that his death looked very unnatural and insisted on performing an autopsy to try to establish the real cause of death. Additionally, there was another study suggesting a heart attack and the scratches on his body were most likely self-inflicted. Hearing this, the detective asked if he had any suspects and why he decided to focus on the autopsy. He recalled the old woman who kept accusing the boy, who was also a resident of the settlement, of murder, so they needed to find out everything. But Kong didn't share his thoughts, as he believed the old woman's words couldn't be trusted so easily and it didn't raise any suspicions for him. Moreover, Song Hyun-ho had a strange premonition and thought this investigation could hide many secrets about what was really happening in the settlement. Suddenly, he realized that the suspect in Kang's case was from outside and was very similar in age to the murderer the old woman suspected. In other words, all the crimes could be linked to the same person, and realizing this, Kong ordered an urgent search for him. Meanwhile, a new patrol began in the settlement and the main character showed up, running late again. This infuriated Hyun-seop. Moreover, Seoko was busy that evening and couldn't patrol the settlement with them. Therefore, they had to do all the work, just the two of them. Not wasting any time, the main character suggested they finally start the task ahead of them. At that moment, they set off to circle the entire settlement, which was standard procedure. Suddenly, a conversation broke out between the men. Hyun-seop asked why the police had come, as he knew they were standing by the main character's house. To his surprise, the boy didn't deny it and confirmed his words. He also replied that the investigators weren't very talkative, as they feared the people in the settlement might share everything and spread information to each other. However, Hyun-seop replied that he shouldn't worry, as the people in the settlement weren't doing anything illegal. Moreover, he also believed that any problems should be resolved within the settlement itself and, if possible, not escalate to the police. Suddenly, the hero asked why the sacred tree at the entrance to the settlement had been cut down, shocking his colleague. Hyun-seop couldn't believe that anyone could know what had happened, especially a newcomer who had recently settled in their village. But the main character tried to pry information from him about the cut-down tree, despite him trying to steer clear of the topic. Even after a direct question, he continued to change the subject, and it was clear how nervous he was becoming. The men continued walking while the boy didn't give up trying to find out the real reason. He felt sad that the tree he had known since childhood was no longer there. Suddenly, Ja-eun approached them, being escorted by Deo, who was still trying to win her over. He attempted to give her a bag of sweets, but she flatly refused to accept them. She truly didn't want his gifts and tried to return everything. But her actions were perceived as offensive by the boy, who forcefully tried to give it back to her. Suddenly, they noticed the night patrol ahead and Deo immediately calmed down, leaving the girl alone. Shining a flashlight at the people, the officer asked what they were doing out so late. Suddenly, Ja-eun spotted the main character and smiled at him kindly. It seemed as if they could be on a secret date, as everything pointed to that at that moment. Realizing her position, Ja-eun tried to justify herself, as she couldn't do anything about his advances. Moreover, she didn't want Hyo Myong to misunderstand her and insisted she was on a diet. However, the men didn't stop and began to insist that she was obliged to accept food and sweets from him. The bewildered girl was on the verge of tears, as she could no longer resist the two men. The main character, witnessing what was happening, understood the difficult position she was in. He wanted to support her and change something, so he calmly approached her. He took the bag from her and said he was ready to eat everything instead of her, as he wouldn't refuse such a gift. After all, food shouldn't go to waste, and something needed to be done with it. His actions greatly angered Deo, but he did nothing, just seethed at the main character. Meanwhile, the patrol continued, and the main character kept doing his job with a bag full of food and sweets. Despite the girl needing nothing, Hyun-seop viewed his behavior as audacity. Suddenly, approaching the house of the deceased Song-sik, he froze in place. What he saw there terrified him, as shining the light into the yard, he saw a woman who, for some unknown reason, was sitting in the chicken coop with the chickens in the middle of the night. What happened next shocked him so much that he couldn't believe his own eyes. Even the main character, who always remained calm, was frightened this time. For before them was Zhang, who had lost her mind and was eating a chicken. Her eyes were bloodshot. Meanwhile, events shifted back to the elder's house. There, he, along with his charges, was trying to figure out the cause of the sudden deaths in the settlement, and they concluded that someone might have actually killed them. But when the elder turned to his charge, he noticed that he wasn't listening at all. He was in some sort of trance, continuously muttering something in an incomprehensible language. It looked so strange that everyone in the room panicked. But the elder understood that he might be possessed by evil spirits and tried to stop his seizure. He began to try to dive into his consciousness and stop what was happening to him. It became clear to him that the man was very scared, even though his mother should have been protecting him. The elder continued to try to rectify the situation, and only words about the mother and her miraculous power helped him recover. The brothers bowed and honored the incredible power of the mother. The elder continued to speak to them in her name, assuring them that there was no need to be afraid. It seemed the attack was passing, and Hyunseop was feeling much better, as he was convinced he had his mother's protection and that she loved him. After a while, the attack subsided, and the man returned to his normal state. When everything was over, the elder exhaled in relief and looked him in the eyes. Then he reached for his own cigarettes. Everything had passed, and Hyunseop managed to cope with his fear. He believed the old man's words and was convinced that he shouldn't be afraid. This happened because, due to recent events, he had many doubts about what they were doing. But what the elder said next was a real shock for everyone. He ordered everything to be burned to hide his involvement in the elder's disappearance. Meanwhile, in the local store, Deo was sitting, having come to work in place of his mother. He was reflecting on the events of the previous night and was very angry at the main character, as he was convinced he was trying to humiliate him in front of the girl. He didn't even notice when a customer entered the store and asked him for a pack of cigarettes. He was also planning to make other purchases. For this, he reached into the fridge but didn't notice the coffee he usually loved to drink. The seller gave him the coffee for free as compensation for being accused of missing goods, trying to make amends. But Hyunseop wasn't angry and paid for all the goods, as he was troubled by much more important issues and was thinking about how to avoid punishment and prove that he wasn't involved in the disappearance of the old man and many other crimes. He hoped for quick changes in their settlement and was convinced that life was about to get much better. Deo inquired about the main character and asked if Hyunseop was familiar with him. He hid his true intentions and said he was just curious. But everyone knew that it was because of the main character that all the men of the settlement had gathered and gone to his house to make sure he was who he claimed to be. Heavy thoughts and doubts wouldn't let Deo work peacefully, and he constantly sought opportunities to take revenge on the main character. But the man convinced him that there was nothing special about him, and he didn't deserve any special treatment. He also called him a Slovak and said he only lunged at everyone like an angry dog. His words managed to comfort Deo, who began to reassess him and no longer viewed him as a serious competitor. Suddenly, a car pulled up to the store. The same detective got out and entered the store. His appearance made the guys nervous, and they were impressed by how strong and big he was. Hyunseop even wondered if he could compete with his brother and face him in a fair fight. However, he bought almost nothing, choosing only a soda, and approached the counter to pay for his goods. He also mentioned that he was looking for a guy, as he knew he was a resident of the settlement. Deo became so nervous that he thought he was the guy the big man was looking for. But hinting, he received the answer that the person he was looking for was at least good-looking. After a while, the detective was already heading toward the main character's house. Stopping by his house, he got out of the car and began to examine everything carefully. But not seeing anyone around, he headed toward his gate. He was very surprised when he realized that the boy lived in such a godforsaken place in his youth. Calling out to the guy, he realized no one could hear him and was about to head inside the house. But the gate was locked, so he had to knock and call for the main character, hoping he would show up. When no one answered, he admitted he was with the police and was conducting an investigation. But it was all in vain, and he thought about coming back later. Just as he was about to leave, the gate swung open. The main character had finally heard him and came out to meet him. The detective recognized his face. After all, he was the one who had saved him from a robbery. The guy didn't deny it. He remembered him well. The detective said he was very glad to meet him since it had taken quite a while to find him. He also wanted to collaborate with the main character and take some statements regarding the investigation happening in the settlement. But the guy didn't seem particularly eager to help and asked if it was really necessary. He thought they were planning to arrest him, and he was really worried he might have done something illegal right in front of a cop. Understanding how that situation might look, the detective tried to find a justification and explain it from another angle. But Heo Myong was already ready to head to the police station and was about to step out of his own yard. Meanwhile, the investigator just wanted to verify his identity and asked to see his documents. At that moment, the main character realized he had no options. So he agreed and was going to go look for his documents. But that could take too long, so the detective decided to wait for him outside. He hoped the guy would be able to find something and wouldn't try to run or hide. After a while, the guy returned. He managed to find some documents and was ready to show them. Thrilled by the news, Kong couldn't wait to take a look at them, and besides, he brought along some wanted posters. As he examined the documents, he carefully read every detail. He also noticed that the guy was born in 98. Once the check was complete, he handed the documents back to the guy. Thanking him for his cooperation, he was about to give him the most important thing. And at that moment, he handed him the wanted poster. This startled him as he looked at the crumpled document with fear. The detective explained that he should pay attention and notify them if he found someone resembling the description. Looking at the document, Heo Myong realized he was being sought after. He struggled to contain his anger and emotions. However, he was failing miserably, and noticing this, the detective kindly smiled and said goodbye. The next night, during another patrol, Hyunseop and Seoko arrived at the house of a deceased patient. They were moving his bed to another spot and cleaning up inside the house. They also had to remove the carpet from the floor. The work was very hard and the men were getting tired, but everything had to be cleaned perfectly. It was really frustrating that all their efforts were in vain. After all, despite everything they did for the patient, he had died so suddenly. Seoko was convinced it was all due to evil spirits that decided to take his life. From the next room, he heard his brother's voice, who had finished with the carpet. But his voice sounded very scared, and he decided to check the next room to see for himself what was happening. Because what they saw made it clear they had indeed visited the patient many times. Seoko ordered to clean up the remains and all the evidence. It became clear that under the carpet was a huge number of protective talismans that the village chief had made for the old man when he was still alive. They needed to be burned. Meanwhile, it was getting very hot outside, and it felt like summer. The main character and his girl were sitting in a shop enjoying ice cream to cool off a bit. Suddenly, the girl started thanking the guy for saving her again. Specifically, for taking her snacks and getting rid of that annoying suitor. But he didn't think his actions were anything special since she had already said she didn't want to eat and was on a diet. However, Ja-eun kept thanking him and wouldn't stop. Suddenly, she noticed someone approaching the shop. As it turned out, it was the village chief along with his followers who followed him everywhere like loyal dogs. She cheerfully greeted them. And Heo Myong noticed that the main character was sitting next to her. The guy didn't pay any attention to their arrival and didn't greet them. They just moved on with their business towards No Sukdae's house. Hyunseop said that all the evil happening in the settlement could have started because of the cutting down of the sacred tree. The girl suggested that the men might be very busy dealing with some important matters. Suddenly, the guy had a question for her. He asked about the sacred tree and why it was cut down. But his words scared the girl so much that she dropped her ice cream and couldn't respond. He noticed this and was very surprised to see such a reaction. But the girl remembered she had urgent matters and, without answering, was about to leave him. It was clear she was very nervous, and after a quick goodbye, she walked away. It seemed she knew the reason, but there was a ban in the settlement, and no one could talk about it. As it turned out, the village chief was heading to the house of the missing Song-sik. After all, the events that had happened with his wife the day before couldn't just be left alone. But the woman remembered nothing and couldn't believe their words, especially about having eaten a live chicken. Everything that happened was very strange since Hyunseop, along with the main character, had helped her that night. And hearing this, she couldn't believe his words. After all, there was no way a rookie would help her, especially after she started accusing him. Her efforts to remember everything turned out to be in vain. Suddenly, the village chief noticed the scars on the woman's body and that she couldn't stop scratching herself. Even her efforts couldn't help as the itching was very intense. Then, the village chief ordered to unwrap the package they had brought to her house. Their actions frightened the woman greatly, as she didn't know what could be inside. As it turned out, it contained everything needed for the village chief to make a talisman which everyone in the settlement had. The bone was made from very rare wood that had been struck by lightning, and the hair was from the tail of a white horse. The ink was very fresh as the village chief had made it that morning. But the woman didn't understand why he was trying to do all this for her. However, he looked at her closely, convinced she understood what was really happening to her. The thing is, the woman was being punished, and her severe illness was a manifestation of that punishment for her sins. But it seemed she didn't quite understand what the old man meant. Because of this, the woman could easily fall under the influence of spirits, and the entity she had seen recently was not her husband. He also gave her a talisman that was supposed to protect her from spirits. Hearing his words, the old woman began to scream in fear as she didn't understand how the punishment from the sick could fall upon her and what wrong she could have done. But the village chief didn't listen. He felt that the punishment on the woman was very strong, and he was only concerned about whether she could endure it and how long it would last. The talisman he gave her should have prevented spirits from entering her. Understanding the position she was in, the old woman began to plead with the men for help and was ready to do anything to avoid the fate of the deceased patient. She also begged her mother to help her escape and avoid the terrible punishment. The man tried to calm her down and grabbed her hand. She didn't hear him at all, so he forced the talisman into her hands. It was their only hope, as there were no medicines for the terrible illness in the settlement. The only thing the woman could do was pray and endure, as things would only get worse. Losing all hope, she watched as the men left her alone with the grief they had brought with them. Meanwhile, at the police station, work was in full swing and everyone was busy searching for any information about the main suspect, who was now the main character. But the guy had never been arrested, and besides, he couldn't be called a witness, so there were no claims against him. The detective's assistant, who seemed to be new, was convinced they were wrong to suspect Hyo Myong. But they were intrigued by the fact that the guy only used cash and lived far from the city in a real backwater. Kong ordered the assistant to start from scratch and carefully check all the information about the main character. He was convinced they didn't know everything and might have missed some important detail. Or the hero was just doing his job very well and was a true professional. However, despite the lack of evidence, the detective had no intention of removing him from the list of suspects. At that moment, he was preparing to go to the address listed on his ID. However, it wasn't entirely clear what exactly he wanted to do. Meanwhile, the scene shifted to the city. The unlucky lover was talking on the phone with an unknown person, warning that he was at the entrance of the subway. His accomplice was trying to coordinate him and guide him to the place where they were supposed to meet. The meeting place was an ordinary cafe that didn't stand out among other establishments in the city. The unknown person saw his accomplice through the window and immediately waved to get his attention. He asked if everything was all right and if there had been any trouble on the way. However, upon entering, Deo was surprised by such a meeting place, as it was a cafe that only sold ice cream. In fact, there was nothing special about it. His accomplice liked the place and was a true ice cream fan. They were talking about the fruitless search for some man that Deo had mentioned. Hearing about the failure, he got angry, realizing he had wasted his trip to the city in hopes of success. But the detective agency had managed to find something, and the stranger wasn't completely empty-handed. He handed Deo a note. Deo, glancing suspiciously, didn't take it right away. But as it turned out, the person Deo had asked to find had a child, and the information was about her. Therefore, the person with the child could be exactly who he was looking for. This intrigued Deo, and he was ready to pay for the photo of the person he was trying to find and the address of her house. His partner tried to dissuade him from going inside the house, as even though the registered address was the same, someone else might be living in the apartment while the guy was away. Moreover, breaking into someone else's home was illegal even for police officers. But the director insisted on his point. He said the guys just needed to keep quiet and not tell anyone about this incident. However, the doors were locked and he didn't understand how they were going to get inside without breaking in. Unable to stand it, the director forcefully pushed aside the guy who was blocking his way. He didn't have time for a discussion. Everything needed to be done quickly and efficiently. He started entering a password that would allow him to get inside and open the door. The password was very simple and consisted of numbers that represented the owner's birth date. And now it was clear why he needed the main character's personal information. After a few seconds, the door opened and the men could calmly enter the house. It seemed his partner was very nervous and afraid they might face consequences for their actions. As it turned out, the apartment was completely empty, and it didn't look like anyone lived there or that it was being rented out. Even though they didn't have a warrant, this was their only chance to find more information about the main character, who was the main suspect. But they weren't planning to leave anything behind, and after checking, they wanted to quietly exit the premises and lock the door behind them. Moreover, the room was very small and finding the necessary information wouldn't take them long. The detective began rummaging through personal belongings and checking drawers. He ordered his partner, who was standing there afraid to make a move, to do the same. This case was very important, as the information or any personal items they found would determine the further course of the investigation. After just 10 minutes of searching, the man managed to find photographs of the main character from his past. There were very few of them, so they needed to examine them carefully and draw some conclusions about his life. From the photographs, it was clear he was a student at the police academy and quite intelligent. After all, he had managed to rise to the rank of non-commissioned officer in the army. Moreover, he served as a non-commissioned officer in a special forces flotilla, and achieving such accomplishments was very difficult. However, it was strange that he hadn't become a police officer, and the men viewed this as a waste of time and effort. It wasn't hard to establish a connection between his graduating from the police academy and then serving in the army, but it was unclear what he did after his service and how he made a living. Moreover, it was clear that the guy was trained and skilled with weapons. However, they had spent a lot of time searching and decided to tidy up after themselves and leave. Meanwhile, the scene shifted to the settlement, to the house of the sick old woman. The woman was feeling so unwell that the residents of the settlement began to visit her and offer their help. They scratched her back as the itching became more unbearable with each passing day. However, it turned out that no one came to see her except for Jaun. She also mentioned that a few days ago, the village chief had come to her house and handed her a talisman that was supposed to protect her from evil spirits and safeguard her home. Because of this, the woman felt abandoned and unwanted for a long time, as she was the only one who blamed the main character, and no one else supported her. But the girl thought differently, as it seemed she was the one supporting him. The woman explained that she had been possessed by evil spirits and couldn't tell good from bad, and couldn't believe that her husband could have attacked the girl. But Jaun reassured her that there was no reason to worry, as the cut wasn't deep, and besides, the boy had managed to protect her. She also insisted that she felt nothing for him other than gratitude for saving and protecting her. However, she couldn't convince the grandmother, who believed that he might be interested in her and even liked her. Yet the girl smiled and continued to deny any connection with him. Suddenly, she took the girl by the hand. She didn't really know what had happened to her husband or if he was even alive, but every time she saw the main character, she felt a strange sensation she couldn't describe. She asked if Jaun really thought he was a good person and if there was anything strange about him. But the girl had never had such suspicions, except that he had recently tried to ask her about the sacred tree. He was just curious about why and who had cut it down. But seeing the grandmother getting anxious, she mentioned that she had kept everything a secret, as it could turn against the entire settlement. However, the woman didn't understand how this related to the settlement and why everyone should suffer for what one person had done. Suddenly, she speculated that the main character might be related to Jiangja. The girl began to worry about having told the grandmother anything and begged her not to reveal it and not to say anything to anyone. The old woman promised that their secret would remain just that, a secret. Meanwhile, in one of the city apartments, someone was taking the elevator up. It turned out to be the same girl who had appeared at the police station the day before, talking about her parents and a possible murderer. She was returning home after classes. But suddenly, she noticed a strange man who was watching her intently. This frightened her greatly, especially when he stood up and headed straight for her. He said that she was the one in that photo and began to approach quickly. But the girl, scared by his behavior, tried to get inside her house. In her panic, she couldn't enter the code for the front door correctly. And when the man got closer, she completely stopped breathing. Suddenly, she screamed and begged him to leave her alone. But the man, who turned out to be a loser from the settlement, tried to convince her that he was a good friend of her parents. He also replied that he couldn't reach them and asked where they were at that moment. The girl began to say that it was her uncle's house and was shocked that her parents' friend knew nothing about their death. But he insisted that he had come for work, and it was very important, so he absolutely needed to get in touch with them. However, the girl didn't respond and, with horror on her face, couldn't move. She recalled her testimony at the station and how her father's car had gone missing, and how the detective was surprised when he heard that it had been stolen and the murderer could have driven away in it. She also remembered how she had cried so much and couldn't calm down. All those terrifying events replayed in her mind, and everything flooded back to her, with her parents' death being a turning point. She also recalled the detective's warning that someone might try to find her parents, and in that case she shouldn't say anything, especially that she was their daughter. She couldn't understand why that was necessary. But the police insisted it would be better for everyone, and if someone came, she should call them immediately. To that end, the detective handed her a business card with his number and was ready to come at any moment. So the girl replied that she didn't know anything. However, out of sheer fear and stress, she began to scream to try to draw attention to herself. This infuriated the man, who accused her of lying and continued to bombard her with questions about her parents. He even grabbed her by the shoulders, but she kept insisting that she didn't know anything. Then Dale began to plead, saying it was a matter of life and death. Suddenly, one of the neighbors reacted to the noise in the building. He came out to see what was happening and asked people to keep it down. His appearance could have saved the girl, and she realized it might be her only chance. Gathering her strength and overcoming her fear, she called for help. This made Dale leave her and hurry out of the apartment building. The girl continued to stand in the entrance and scream. Suddenly exhausted, she fell to the ground and didn't get up. The frightened neighbor, who didn't understand what was happening, approached her and wanted to help. But the girl didn't respond and continued to sit on the ground with tears in her eyes. The neighbor asked again if everything was okay and was about to report what had happened to the police. The girl handed him the business card and said that he needed to call that man immediately. Meanwhile, work continued at the police station. The detective and his partner left the suspect's apartment and were heading to their office. Suddenly, the boy received a call from the girl whose parents had been killed. And when he heard what had happened, he couldn't calmly drink his coffee anymore. He asked the girl what the criminal looked like when he had come to her parents and about all the other circumstances. But her description matched that of someone he had seen recently, which scared him even more. So, at that moment, he was preparing to go to her and meet her. At that moment, his partner asked who he was talking to and why the matter was so urgent. Kong recalled the same seller he had met a few days ago in the village store, and there was no doubt it was him. After a while, the girl met with the police officer, but not at the crime scene in the building's entrance, but at the playground, as she was afraid the criminal might return. What had happened had frightened her greatly, as she hadn't expected anyone to come to her home. Moreover, the thief didn't even know about her parents' death and wanted to talk about some work and meet with them. The girl didn't understand what was happening and what that mysterious man really wanted. The detective calmed her down and explained that it could only be a supposition. He also asked her about her parents' other car. After all, it wasn't registered, which could raise certain doubts. Perhaps the vehicle could have been used for something bad. But the police were looking into that, and there was no clear answer to that question. But most likely it involved some illegal activities, and that still needed to be clarified. This scared the girl even more, as she couldn't believe her parents could be involved in such things. However, there was no evidence, and it was just the detective's assumption. Also, when her parents got out of the business, the system they were involved in could have broken down. And to reach the parents, they found their child, as they could be nearby with their child. Hearing the accusations against her parents, the girl began to scream, trying to defend them, as she was convinced they were loyal to their own store. Kong again said it was just his assumption and he wasn't trying to blame them. After all, if they were only running their own store, no one would have started looking for them. And that only meant there was some other kind of activity that the girl knew nothing about. But it only meant that it was just the first visit, and the girl could continue to be sought after. With tears in her eyes, she didn't know what to do next. However, the detective did his best to calm her down and assured her that nothing bad would happen to her. Moreover, he praised her for doing a good job describing the appearance of the man who had come to her house. And by the way, he knew someone who matched her description. Meanwhile, outside, dawn was breaking and the scene shifted back to Zhang's house. She sat in front of the portrait of her missing husband, reminiscing about all the moments they had shared together. She held the talisman that was supposed to protect her and drive away all evil spirits. Suddenly, she remembered that she needed to feed the chickens. Rising, she left the house to do so. However, she made a terrible mistake, as her talisman was left inside and could no longer protect her. As it turned out, the woman headed to the local store but was very surprised to find that it wasn't the trading boy there, but his mother had been sitting there for several days. She explained that her son had gone to the city on business, and Zhang lately had been buying the same product she had previously fed the chickens, but recently she needed it to maintain her own health. For a very long time she had been forced to eat only that. After all, it was the only food that she could swallow. She understood that she needed a balanced diet to maintain her health, but she couldn't do anything about it. Suddenly, as she was leaving the store, she ran into the main character, who was entering. Seeing him, she froze and stopped, as deep down she continued to hate him. The boy also noticed the woman but didn't pay her much attention. He calmly continued on with his shopping, remaining composed. And the grandmother, casting a glance at him, left the store. After buying a lighter, the boy also stepped outside. Lighting a cigarette, he noticed something strange. It turned out that the woman hadn't gone home but was sitting at a table outside the store waiting for him. It seemed something was off with her, or she was behaving very strangely. Her face, still marked by scratches, revealed no emotions, and she coldly continued to watch his every move. And when he moved far enough away from her, she got up and followed him. Step by step, she kept walking behind him. At first, she kept her distance, but with each passing minute she got closer and closer. After a while, she approached the boy within arm's reach, and he knew all along that she was following him but didn't pay it any mind. But unable to hold back, he turned around and asked what she wanted from him and why she was stalking him. In response, he was met only with the woman's laughter. This surprised him greatly, so he repeated his question louder. However, he received the same reaction again, and her laughter grew louder. Suddenly laughing, she asked if he really wanted to know why the tree was cut down. She also intended to tell him why his grandmother had died and what had really happened to her. Hearing her words, the main character looked at her in fear, realizing she was just like her late husband and wasn't in her right mind. But he speculated that the sacred tree and his grandmother might be connected in some way. The woman began to choke and utter many incomprehensible sounds, but it was clear that his grandmother had protected the tree. The boy panicked, thinking the woman might be in trouble. After all, she was trying to force her mouth shut but continued to speak and made unintelligible sounds. The boy moved closer to her and leaned over her. He didn't know what she was doing, but he found it very disgusting to watch and didn't like it. He also warned her not to come any closer to him. After which, he turned around and went on his way. And the woman, left alone, was making incredible efforts to try to open her mouth. But it was all in vain. This terrified her and she rushed back to her home. She hurried to get inside the house, thinking the issue might be related to the talisman she had left inside. Once inside, she tried to find it and make sure it was okay. She understood that a ghost had possessed her again, but she remembered everything clearly and recalled every detail. Suddenly, she saw her talisman and rushed toward it. As she got closer, she became extremely frightened and fell into a real shock. After all, the talisman that the village chief had given her had worked and managed to protect her from the ghost, as it was practically destroyed. And the woman urgently needed to perform a ritual. The next day, the main character approached the house of the girl and her father. He tried to call out to her, and after a while, hearing him, she came outside. But she hadn't expected his visit at all, and thought something terrible might have happened. After all, he had never come to her before, and especially hadn't asked her for anything. As it turned out, he just needed to talk.